us out of here now.
In September of 2017, 2 new science fiction shows premiered. The first was The Orville, a show by writer and producer Seth MacFarlane, which was inspired by both Star Trek and The Twilight Zone. MacFarlane is quoted as saying he wanted to create a science fiction drama that was hopeful and optimistic, which Star Trek had done for a long time. But after Star Trek evolved into something more mature and dark, that left an opening in that space which MacFarlane wanted his new show to fill. The Orville was meant to be a mix of comedy, drama, and sci-fi, tonally falling between shows like Cosmos and Family Guy. Though initially marketed as a comedy by Fox, it quickly became clear that The Orville was actually more of a drama, tackling complex political and social issues in an allegorical way. The other show in question was Star Trek Discovery, the first Star Trek show to return to television since the cancellation of Star Trek Enterprise 12 years prior. Discovery was developed by producer Brian Fuller, fresh off his success with the TV adaptation of Thomas Harris's Hannibal Lecter character. Initially meant to be an anthology show, Star Trek Discovery morphed into a serialized show that followed the trials and tribulations of Lieutenant Michael Burnham in what was to be a more mature, adult, and darker take on the Star Trek universe that was more in line with J.J. Abrams' take on the franchise than the other TV shows that came before it. Unlike The Orville, which aired on broadcast television, Star Trek Discovery was meant to be the flagship series for CBS's foray into subscription streaming services, with it airing exclusively on CBS's All Access network. While initially both shows met with mixed reviews, The Orville seemed to capture the fans who were starved for more traditional Star Trek fare, while Discovery was largely criticized for its deviation from traditional Star Trek narratives. Both shows saw a shift in their second seasons, where The Orville became more of a drama, and much more like the classic Next Generation era Star Trek shows audiences love, while ironically, Star Trek Discovery tried to take a much lighter tone and be more like The Orville in its second season, which was largely overseen by its new showrunner, Alex Kurtzman. At the time of this podcast, both The Orville and Star Trek Discovery are set to be renewed for third seasons. In this episode, we'll be discussing the similarities and differences between these shows, what works for both of them and what doesn't, and where we see the future of both series heading. So set your phasers to stun and rev up your quantum drives for this episode of Roundtable Reviews, as we talk about The Orville versus Star Trek Discovery.
This is the power of math, people!
Hey everyone, how's it going? Matthew Kadish here, author, evil genius, and proud member of the United Planetary Federation of Union. And today we are going to be doing something a little bit different. So instead of talking about a movie, we're actually going to be talking about not just one TV show, but 2 TV shows. We're going to be talking about The Orville and Star Trek Discovery. And today I have the great pleasure of having 2 experts on each subject. The first is JP with Egotastic Funtime, who is an Orville expert. He covers the show extensively on his channel on YouTube. And we also have Nick Ketwolski, who is a Star Trek aficionado, and he is very knowledgeable about Star Trek. And we're going to have an interesting discussion about all these interesting parallels and discrepancies between the 2 shows. So, JP, why don't you introduce yourself and say hi to everyone?
Hey gang, I'm JP from Egotastic Funtime / Talking the Orville. You can find me, of course, at use those things, and it's nice to be here. It's we're all gonna have an egotastic fun time talking about things that we love.
And Nick Ketwolski, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, it's Ketwolski here. You guys can find me on the Ketwolski YouTube channel or on Twitter, and I also echo what JP just said. I look forward to having an egotastic fun time talking about these 2 shows, and I appreciate you guys inviting me on and to hang out and talk about it.
All right, so now that you guys are familiar with our esteemed guests, we're just going to hop right into this. And this question might seem kind of dumb because, we kind of know where everyone stands. But basically, I want to know, what are your thoughts on each series, and which would you say you're the bigger fan of, and why are you a bigger fan of that? So JP, let's start with you.
Well, I am, of course, I'm a huge Star Trek fan, lifelong Star Trek fan. And because of that, that is why I am absolutely in love with the Orville. I grew up with Star Trek, not only just the original series, but then eventually all the 90s stuff, 87 to 2005. And absolutely lived and breathed all 90s Trek. And I think the Orville satisfies that need that I have for that Star Trek, that 90s Trek itch. The Orville gives that to me, and it's an itch that I hope never goes away.
All right, so Ketwolski, which are you a bigger fan of, and why?
So this is a kind of a loaded question because I do feel as though I echo a lot of the things that JP just said. I grew up on the tail end of TNG, going into Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and then Enterprise, and so that's kind of like my bread and butter. And if I had to pick a show which I'm more of a fan of between the Orville and Star Trek Discovery, I would pick Discovery. And the only reason being, and I think we'll get into this kind of later on in our discussion, is based off of the other ideas that we want to talk about, is that, in my opinion, Star Trek Discovery is trying to do something different and trying to do something, I wouldn't say unique, but trying to change things up a little bit, especially in the format with how the show is being presented to the audience. Instead of it being kind of a soft reset per episode, it's kind of one long serialized event throughout the season. So I appreciate it for doing that more. And the reason why, and that's kind of why I put it slightly higher over the Orville, because I feel like the Orville isn't doing enough things that are different to make it stand out.
And that's kind of like the crux of the issue here between the two fan bases, is the Orville really is kind of like, I'm not going to, I guess for lack of a better word, classic Trek, or I should say 90s Trek, really. But yeah, and the people who want more of that kind of gravitate towards Orville. And then Discovery, like Nick said, really is kind of moving in its own direction and trying to do something different than what we're used to. And in a way that's kind of bared mixed results, because there are some people who really like that it's going in a different direction, but then there are kind of like these hardcore fans who are like, this isn't the Star Trek that I know and love. So there's been kind of like a lot of resistance against that. But I find it interesting because me personally, like I've always been more of a Star Wars fan than a Star Trek fan. I know that's like sacrilege, but I worked at Paramount Studios back right before Enterprise premiered, and I'd go down to Star Trek Alley. That's what we called it, because that was where all the sound stages for Star Trek were. And the Next Generation had been shot there, Deep Space Nine, Voyager. So you had this long history of all these Star Trek shows that were there, including the original series, but that was kind of on the other side a lot, because that was when Desilu was still in existence. But I used to go down to Star Trek Alley, and it was funny because you'd see these Klingons sitting outside smoking cigarettes, kind of talking about what they're going to do over the weekend and stuff like that. You'd go and you'd hang out and you'd talk with them, and I'd sneak on the Enterprise set, late at night and kind of sit in the captain's chair and be like, oh, I'm so cool. So I kind of have an affinity, kind of like JP, for the more classic Trek stuff than kind of what they're doing with, I should say, the Alex Kurtzman era.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk a little bit about that, because there is a stark difference in how each show is being written, because you have the Orville, which is actually being written by veterans of that 90s Star Trek era. And then you have the Orville, which is being written by the new wave of the J.J. Abrams Star Trek. So,
you mean the Discovery being written by that?
Yes. Yeah, I'm sorry.
You're okay. No, that's what I make sure. For
yeah. So you have Star Trek Discovery, which is being written by the new school of the J.J. Abrams kind of team. But before we get into that, let's talk about something a little bit broader. JP, you do a lot of really fantastic videos on the Orville, and I watched this. It was either a review or a breakdown, I forget which, but you talked about something which was really interesting, which was about how the Orville was a world that you wanted to live in. And I think one of the biggest elements in any science fiction show is its world building. But one of the aspects of world building that makes a series stand the test of time is whether or not that world is built as a place that the audience wants to live in or revisit over and over and over again. So the Orville has created a really bright and optimistic future that is filled with adventure and humor. It's a very friendly place. It's well lit. It's colorful. It feels like those old 90s, like Next Generation, Voyager type shows. And that's like a world that people would feel comfortable living in. Discovery has kind of taken on a darker and more serious tone, with many of its more hopeful and whimsical elements replaced by big action scenes and very graphic violence. So the question here is, how important do you guys think this, this is a world I want to live in element in science fiction universes is versus the large scale spectacle and adventure of something like Star Trek Discovery or the J.J. Abrams films? And how does that concept affect both series and their potential longevity with audiences? So, Nick, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think it's a fundamental shift. Ultimately, I think that what Discovery is doing is trying to change things to be different than what we expected. It's not really a universe that you would want to live in. And that is different than what we have expected and come to know from Star Trek of the past and all of the different iterations it's had up to this point. And I think it is damaging to a very specific degree. I think that it's dangerous to continue to slide down that slippery slope. But the flip side of it is looking at the option of doing a show, because obviously they could have easily done something like the Orville over at CBS. They could have easily done a show that was much more in line with the way things were back in the day. So I think if you look at the balance of, do we want to just redo what we've done in the past, or do we want to try to pick up the trends that really sci-fi shows, that big hit sci-fi shows are picking up right now, which is this kind of dystopian future where it's this grungy kind of thing and it's brutal environments and people are dying and it's this very rough and tumble kind of thing. And that's the kind of sci-fi tropes that are happening now. So I understand why CBS would want to go down that route and try to create a show like that. But I would make a point is to say that it's not necessarily going to affect the larger universe as a whole, because, and I don't want to get into timelines and all that stuff right now just yet. I don't think, maybe we'll talk about that later, but all of the other fun Trek adventures, as far as we know, still happened. Like, they're still there. So is it possible for them to just have one show that is way over the top serious and has all this violence in it, and then possibly have more fun, more traditional shows? I think the ability to have that breadth of different styles could help improve the world building overall. But right, if you're a brand new fan to Star Trek and you're just sitting down watching Discovery, you're going to be like, this universe is super violent. There's war happening all the time. Space is dangerous. Nobody is friendly and everything is super hectic. So it's rough. It's definitely rough, I think, around the edges, and they haven't quite figured that part out yet.
Yeah, what's interesting is that Star Trek, for the longest time, it was all about exploration, and it was kind of like this highbrow kind of, it was never actually very safe. Like, every episode, the Enterprise would run into a different type of danger that it had to, deal with. But, there was very little like death or violence in these episodes. And it was more about philosophical issues of like, how do we overcome this and still stay true to our ideals? So in a way, it was a lot more optimistic, I guess you could say, than Discovery has kind of been, especially in Discovery's first season. JP, what do you think about the whole world building aspect of like, is this a place where I want to live? And how do you think that affects both shows?
Well, I think as far as like longevity goes, actually, I think wanting to live in a universe is incredibly important. It might be more important than the stories, because as far as franchises like these, Orville, Star Wars, Star Trek, you got to have merchandising, right? You got to have people excited to do cosplay, all that great stuff. Mm-hmm. So I think when a fan wants to live in that universe, that's when they're going to be more excited about it. It's going to be more endearing to them. They're going to want to dress up, go out to the cons, show their fandom. And I think, share it with their children, which then makes their children a fan, and then they grow up becoming a fan of it, which is, is how you get the longevity part of it. So I think it's incredibly important, and I would want to live. Now, here's the thing: I've always wanted to live in the Star Trek universe, that utopian future, have those adventures. I even wanted to live on Voyager, not necessarily, out lost in the Delta Quadrant. That kind of sucks. Aliens have weird hair in the Delta Quadrant.
Oh, yeah, the Kazon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I still wanted to hang out with the crew. But then the Orville came along. I'm like, no, I would rather live in the Orville universe. As much as I love Star Trek, and I deeply love Star Trek, they are better than me. I'm not good enough to hang out with Commander Riker and Data and Geordi. I'm too much of a regular Joe, a regular guy. The Orville, on the other hand, I can hang out with any of those people. They may not like me, but I think we can have a conversation once in a while in the mess hall. So for me, it's incredibly important.
I think you and Dan would get along really well on the Orville.
Yeah.
You just sit around talking about your playlists and all that good stuff.
So I just want to say, so that's an interesting thing that you say, JP, which is something I haven't really thought about, really, which is Gene, when he, started the show, and then like the intent to keep on that torch bearing kind of utopian society over the years has been like it's almost alien in itself. It's almost like bizarrely unattainable to where we are now, which has always been somewhat of the appeal, which is like we as a society right now can't even think about living in as much harmony as they do. And it's almost a little too sterile the way that you're kind of saying that, as the Orville definitely feels a bit more relatable in terms of their characters, because they seem much more approachable. They seem much more like everyday kind of Joe Blow type people. And that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that. And that is a fair way to look at it. Which is definitely takes a little bit away from the Star Trek utopian society. I don't know if it affects me as much as you. I still want to live in Star Trek society as much as opposed to the Orville, just because, I think it's just, maybe nostalgia stake, or because I've grown up on it, and that's just where my first love is. But it is an interesting point that you made there. I like that.
What's interesting is that Gene Roddenberry, when he was, the showrunner of The Next Generation, which lasted for about, I think, the first 2 seasons or season two and a half seasons. His mandate was no interpersonal conflict. His vision was society had advanced so far that, human beings could just get along with each other. They were like almost enlightened. And it wasn't until he kind of stepped down and, the new showrunner took his place and moved it more towards, the character approach, which we're going to talk about in a bit, that, I feel like people start to connect with the characters more because they became more human. So, and whereas with the Orville, it's almost like if you took people who are just walking around the street today and put them on a spaceship, like that's the adventures that you would have. So there is something to be said about how, just look at Gordon and Lamar, like those 2 guys, especially in the first season, because they were just sitting at the helm, drinking sodas and cracking jokes. It's like, that's the type of thing most people do at their job.
And they weren't having a great time star mapping. They'd rather do anything else, and they were vocal about it. So it's, I always considered the Orville to be like a workplace, a workplace like drama. Yeah, it's a work show. These people are at work. Yeah, on Star Trek, they were on a mission. In the Orville, they're at work, and they just have, they take lunches together. They hang out. They do stuff. There's a lot of after hours going on in the Orville, as opposed to just being on the bridge all the time.
That's very true. Yeah, I would say that you're right. Actually, a lot of the sequences do take place like kind of after hours, as you just said. I guess it kind of depends on what you're looking for, because when we're talking, like, I'm remembering like as a kid, as a teenager, going through all the things that teenagers go through, and isolation, and especially being like a Star Trek nerd, you go through isolation and you're feeling kind of that way. And so when I watched like reruns of TNG on television, or even, Deep Space Nine, stuff like that, which did have interpersonal drama, but seeing the crews work together was inspiring to me, because it was like, these people are really great friends and they all work together. So I guess it does kind of depend on what you're looking for necessarily. And I think, having that breadth of different types of experiences in that universe is important. I think just as important as creating a universe that people want to live in baseline, and then showing that there's all different aspects of that.
Yeah. There's like different formats, different aspects, which with the Orville, every episode, you kind of never know what you're going to get. Is this going to be a serious episode, a more, a funnier episode, a world building episode, or a character episode, which they've done a lot of character building and world building in season.
Or a mythology episode, like with the Kalons.
Yeah. All of a sudden, you go from one episode where it's like a little romantic, episode, and the very next one, you have a huge threat to the galaxy. And then they're all working together, like in Command Performance, which was just the second episode of season 1, when we're still trying to figure out what is this show? What's going on? What is this show about? And then all of a sudden, the crew rally together. They all work together, and they're excited, going, "Yeah!" When Alara says, yeah, we're going to go and we're going to save the captain and we're going to save the commander against Union's orders. And, you know, they all pulled together. And right then I was like, okay, this is, you know, the show for me. This feels like Star Trek to me. It looks like Star Trek to me, but of course it's not Star Trek. It is the Orville doing its own thing. It's kind of like we went, you know, we as, you know, a group of friends went and we're living in the Star Trek world, but we're doing it our own way.
And you know what's interesting? There was something you mentioned earlier about like a father and son watching the show. And I can remember growing up, like me and my dad would sit down and watch reruns of the Next Generation when it was in syndication. And that was always like a big thing to me because out here in Las Vegas, I belong to the Star Trek fan club, which is like the biggest Star Trek fan club in the United States. And when I go to the meetings and meet with people, like people bring their kids and like they're, you know, it's like something that the parents do with their children, which is watch and enjoy Star Trek. And one of the things that really bothered me in terms of like how dark Discovery went, especially with the first season, was that I don't feel like Discovery was something you could watch with your children and enjoy. Like, Nick, what do you think about that? Because like, you know, you had Klingon titties, you had like F-bombs being dropped, you had really graphic scenes of like torture and violence.
Right.
You know, is that something that you think was a smart decision to take something like Star Trek in terms of direction?
So
like away from the family-friendly stuff.
Yeah, so I kind of go back to what I said earlier, which is they definitely are trying to connect the show into modern sci-fi show tropes, which is right now the darker, more grungier, more brutal kind of tones like you experience. I think honestly probably started with Battlestar Galactica and has since kind of continued on. I view like the show like The Expanse as like the spiritual successor to that mantle that Battlestar Galactica remake kind of did. Like that's the spiritual successor there. And that's a very dark and brutal thing. And people really like that, you know? So I really do think that they sat in a boardroom meeting and they were like, well, can we just make a family friendly show? And they're like, well, no, all these new sci-fi shows are dark and brooding and they're dropping F-bombs and everyone's cheating on each other and they're having sex. That's what we need to have in Star Trek because that's what people want to see. And I really do think that they did that. I really think that conversation, and probably people were like, that's a really bad idea. We shouldn't do that. And they went with it anyways. And it's again
going in that direction with Enterprise, you know, back, you know, years ago, where they were like, let's move it to more darker and adult like direction. And
they tried to sex up Enterprise a little bit. They had a lot of long shots of people rubbing lotions on themselves in the decon chamber. You know, they tried to sex the show up a little bit, which, you know, but it was still very much in the realm of something you could watch with your children. And
they eventually pulled that stuff back because they realized it wasn't quite right.
It wasn't, yeah. And it especially since that show in particular had tried to have, you know, a foot in both ponds there and tried to be like more adult and more kid friendly. But this one went full on adult. I do think that going full on adult with Discovery was a risk. I don't think it's paid off as much as they'd like, but I do know that they have announced like they have that Nickelodeon show coming out that they want to do. And I feel like at some point in time, somebody in the boardroom was like, listen, like, you know, JP, you talked about it earlier, where the longevity of the fans, the reason why this show has lasted for 50 years is people like me. I wasn't alive when TOS came out. I wasn't alive when TNG came out. I wasn't alive then. I wasn't around, but I'm such a huge fan of it because my dad introduced it to me and we would sit down and we would watch the shows and it was fine to watch because even as a young kid, I was watching them because it was family friendly and it was good content. So somewhere along the line, they figured that out over the last couple of years. They're like, we really need to get this younger fan base involved to keep the franchise alive. But it was very risky and I don't think it's necessarily paid off as well as they would have liked it to. Overall for the entire, you know, viewing audience.
But, you know, Orville isn't all family friendly either. Like, you know, remember the boarded sex holodeck episode where it's like him having orgies for the entire time.
He was having orgies, you know, and
that's something that you might not want your kids to be exposed to.
There's a couple episodes where certain, you know, parents that have, you know, certain relationships with their kids are like, I can't have my kids watch that. I'm like, okay, totally understandable. That's adult. Other parents, on the other hand, be like, okay, that's because it wasn't graphic. They're like, okay, that's just a type of preference that exists in the world. It's diversity, right?
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about how the Orville handles this stuff is that they kind of use the whole like science fiction wrapper as a shield to tackle really heavy subjects. It's like, okay, well, Bortus is gay, but he's gay because he's an alien that comes from an all-male society. So you can explore, issues of homosexuality and, stuff like that under the umbrella of it being sci-fi and not really offend anybody. Whereas I think, classic Star Trek used to be a lot like that as well. But I think in the modern era, they've gotten kind of more into the political messaging realm, like where you have a perfect example of this is season 2, where you have the mansplainer who basically like dies because he refuses to listen to a woman type thing. Whereas I feel like the Orville handles these political topics a little bit more subtly than, Star Trek Discovery has. What do you think about that, Nick?
I think that, I'll say two things one about the mansplainer. I hated that. I hated that character.
I think a lot of people did.
I hated what they did there. Even if we were to give them the writers 100% benefit of the doubt that was not what they were intending with that character, they just wanted him to be annoying and we would cheer when he died. That's fine. Even if we wanted to give them that, I don't believe that, but giving them that, the way the viewing audience of today is going to view that is under a different lens. And you have to understand and be responsible for that content that people are going to be consuming and know how they're going to interpret it, which is you have a white male character who's mansplaining and being a jerk to all the females on the show and then dies. And it's like, right, you built that character just to send a political message. And that's the way people viewed it. That's the way I viewed it. I didn't like it at all. I really hated it.
Have the courtesy to wear a red shirt when he was
doing it. He didn't. No, that's ridiculous.
Yeah. What also I didn't like about that was, he died. They just went on with their business. I don't think they even mentioned him again.
He didn't even get a funeral.
Yeah, he didn't get some big Spock level funeral either.
But maybe they did one on the Enterprise. They didn't know him on Discovery. Maybe it was the new transfer.
Yeah, to love him is to know him, and to know him is to love him.
That's right.
In the words of Data.
But like as a writer, as storytellers, whenever you kind of cross that line from subtle political messaging into propaganda, where it's obviously the writers just pushing their own kind of beliefs onto the audience. I think one of the beauties of Star Trek, classic Star Trek, was that they kind of did what the Orville does now, in the sense that they lay out, hey, here's the political issue that we're going to tackle, and they lay out both sides, and they never really land on one side or the other. I mean, in the Orville, you do have instances where it's like the main character's like, it's not right to do this, but at the same time, at the end, they don't kind of say this is the absolute right way to think about it. In fact, most of the times on the Orville, the side that they're against tends to win out. So like there's that kind of like downer of an ending, but it also kind of allows the audience to be like, okay, well, I'm not being pushed in one side or the other. I'm allowed to make up my own mind about which outcome was right and which outcome was wrong. And it seems like Discovery consistently goes the propaganda route as opposed to the political messaging route. And there's, I guess, like, depending on what you believe, like sometimes that can be right or wrong. But JP, like, how do you think these shows handle, the political messaging versus propaganda?
Well, just like you said, and I've mentioned this a lot, with the Orville, they will all the time, they present you with two different sides of an argument, and both sides actually get some, their word in there, and then it falls one way or the other. It doesn't tell you how to think. It just teaches you how to think and make up your own decisions. Discovery, not as much, but I think it might also have to do with the writers on Discovery just being younger. There's a certain, the writers on the Orville are older. They've done a lot of the, previous Star Trek stuff. They've just, matured a little bit more to have that little bit more grounded, wider world view. Whereas on Discovery, they're not quite there yet. They want to fight, they want to fight for their side, or, whatever side that might be, their opinion. That just comes, I think, with, how, maturity, how old, once you get to be a really old man like me, you just see both sides of of things a little bit more. And I think the writers on the Orville are slightly more experienced people. As far as
Nick, the Discovery, it's Star Trek has always kind of been political. I mean, you had the first interracial kiss on there, like it was a multicultural, like you had a Russian,
right? It was a big deal, right?
The Cold War. So there's this argument to be made where it's like, well, political messaging has always been a part of Star Trek. You shouldn't try to take it out of there. But I feel like there's a certain quality to a story where the writer is intelligent enough to not make the audience aware that he's preaching to them, as opposed to just kind of like suggesting, here's a morality tale. How well do you think Discovery kind of, handles their politics?
So I would say the first thing would be is that the Orville, it makes it easier to do the viewpoint of the different stories and kind of presenting those different conundrums and talking about them and stuff like that, because they don't do that serialized approach, which is something that Star Trek Discovery has obviously gone away from. It's obviously much easier to do that when you have self-contained stories in each episode. When you have a 13-episode story, 14-episode story arc, it's harder to present a clear message as to what it is you're really saying. Because really, what was the point of season 2 of Discovery other than just time travel is wonky? There was no clear sci-fi message there. As far as the political stuff, I would. And I've talked about this a lot in my reviews, every episode of Discovery for me kind of ebb and flows. Sometimes it's really great writing, in my opinion, and then other times it's absolutely a nightmare and it makes me want to punch myself in the face. Because I think the writers themselves are either inconsistent or, as JP said, maybe they're not quite as comfortable with writing science fiction at this level where they need to be at. Maybe they need some more classical science fiction writers on the writing team to kind of guide those messages, to make the messages more subdued. And I would say that you mentioned earlier about the gay thing. Obviously we have the gay couple on Star Trek Discovery, and some people are just against that because they don't want gay people on Star Trek for some, for whatever reason. Some people don't like it because I feel like it's a forced political message. And I feel like it's challenging because I feel like they're trying to appease an audience that wants the virtue signal, while also trying to gather in and say, well, it's just part of these characters' backstory. And they don't slam that particular hammer down over our heads. They just engage it as if it's just a regular relationship. But again, it's that lens, right? When you put that there and it's not in kind of a subdued, structured way, it kind of comes across as you're hitting people over the head with it, as opposed to something that's more subdued. So it's kind of right in the middle. I know I'm kind of going back and forth there, but it's kind of right in the middle. Some episodes, it's right in your face and they're slapping you in the face with it. And other episodes, it's more subdued and more real. One of the better episodes that we had of the season was when they had Hugh Culber kind of wandering around the ship, and he gets into that fight with Tyler in the kitchenette area, the mess hall, and that was a very real character reaction. Him being gay had nothing to do with it. Obviously, he was having trouble with his relationship, which is a homosexual relationship, but that wasn't the center of it. But then other times they bring up the gay thing and they try to make it either it's a joke, or they try to kind of hit you over the head with it in certain other areas. So I think
scene.
What's up?
With that Philippa scene when she was
right, the Philippa scene.
Yeah,
and some people are "Oh, I love that," and I'm some people said that, and I'm no, that scene was really awkward and very strange and unnecessary. And
you are savvier than he was.
You do know that he's gay, right?
Don't be so binary. In my universe, he was pansexual. And we had DEFCON level fun together. And you too, puppy.
Did you just call me puppy?
Well, in my universe, and pretty much any universe I can possibly imagine, I'm gay, and so is he.
Of course you are. I'm glad we all see what's right in front of us. And now, if you'll excuse me, I need to talk to Captain Pike about setting a course for Esop's Pole. What just happened?
That's again, that's what I'm saying. The writers are kind of wishy-washy with their abilities to kind of subdue it. And I think maybe that'll come with experience and kind of understanding these characters more, which I'm okay with being patient on. But right, the Orville went and hired writers that understood how to do this kind of thing. And even though I feel like some of their stories that they tell are kind of rehashes of old sci-fi shows that we've already seen, they're doing it with a kind of unique spin. Like you mentioned the orgy episode. I actually loved that episode because it dealt not only with the homosexual piece of it, which was, again, super subdued. They don't even really acknowledge it that much on the show in that fashion, but it was dealing with addiction, pornography addiction, cheating, essentially having an emotional cheat on your spouse, therapy. That was a great episode, and it was very, very well structured and had all of those elements to it. So that was a really great episode, and so that was, I like how they wrapped that together. And I don't think that crafting is there yet for Discovery.
The really interesting thing is that there's so many parallels between these two shows because, Orville is basically a knockoff of Star Trek, but in particular, the second seasons, I think the biggest problem I have with the homosexual relationship between Stamets and I forget the doctor's name. What's the doctor's name?
Hugh Colber. Hugh Colber. Sorry.
Colbert.
So basically, the problem I have with that relationship is like I don't really like either of the characters. Like they're not very interesting. I'm not invested in their relationship. And then you kind of contrast that with Bortus and Clyden on the Orville, and it's like I'm into that relationship. Like I can see that dynamic. I can see the relationship problems and how they kind of like play off of each other. I mean, like when Clyden got a divorce by stabbing Bortus in the chest, I'm like, I can understand that feeling, Well,
Clyden's interesting because Clyden is very different than all other Moclans, right? He's joyful. He's almost like a grandma when you first meet him.
Well, he's also a post-op. But he's always got a smile on his face, all this stuff, and then but then we learn more and more about him. It's like, oh, he's a horrible bigot. I mean, he is absolutely the worst. And then that's kind of an interesting dynamic though, because it's kind of like that certain family member that you have, that uncle that comes over on Thanksgiving. You absolutely adore him, but then he starts opening his mouth and talking about all this hateful, bigoted stuff. And you're like, oh, that's right. But his bigotry is ingrained into his culture. And in a way, it's like Bortus is almost the one who's outside the norm in that respect. Mm-hmm. And as an audience member, like, you look at that and you process it. But just in terms of like, okay, like both shows have this gay couple, but one of them is fascinating and you love watching them and you love learning more about their relationship and seeing the trials and tribulations that they go through. Like that episode where they were both addicted to smoking. Yeah, that was amazing. Right. And then like you look at Hugh and Stamets, and it's like they listen to opera together. I mean, like there's really
Stamets doesn't like opera.
There's no chemistry there,
Right. So I would say again that is beyond the fact that it's personal preferences. Obviously, if some people like the character, that that's fine. I would say again that's another symptom of doing the serialized approach is you don't have the opportunity to have like the Paul Stamets and Hugh Colbert episodes, where this is just the episode about them. Their whole relationship dynamic was sprinkled in across the entire season. And right, some things did not work really well. I liked the fact that at the end of it all, I didn't like how they kind of wrapped it up with him kind of being there with him. Sorry, I know you haven't seen the rest of it. JP, you said you hadn't seen the rest of?
Oh, no, I'm all caught up.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Oh, you haven't caught up. Okay.
So basically, spoilers.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, we're getting right into that. But at the end where he was like, Hugh, I'm here. He didn't go to the Enterprise, or he came back from the Enterprise or whatever it was. I actually didn't like that. I liked the fact that in the episode leading up to that one, I believe it was, where Hugh was like, they had broken up and they had moved out and the relationship had ended, because that felt real. Because right, he's going through this huge identity crisis and he doesn't really know who he is. He came back from literally the dead after being attacked by fungus for who knows how the hell long, and in the in-between world of the mycelial network. So that was very real, and I feel like they kind of undercut that with the fairy tale ending of him coming back to him.
I got to disagree with you on this point, because basically I feel like it's a difference in the quality of the writing between the two, because the writers never really, first of all, they made the mistake in the first season of making Stamets very unlikable, at least like for the first half of the season.
Until he got high that one time.
What's that?
No, there was that episode, because at first I didn't like Stamets at all, because I'm like, oh God, he's just so snippy, and but everybody was being rude to each other. Everybody hated
that's true.
Else at the first. Then there was that thing, he got high or something like that, where he was just he was all super nice and funny, and all ever after that moment, ever since then, he's gotten a lot better. I actually really like Stamets.
Yeah, I mean, like he's gotten better over time. But if you look at how the writers handled that relationship there, it was just kind of like, oh, they're gay, so you're supposed to care about them. They really didn't invest anything in between those two. And if you look at how they shifted their focus in the second season, because the second season, even though it had this overarching narrative, serialized narrative throughout the season, each episode was kind of like its own mini adventure. So it was kind of like they took the classic Trek structure where you'd have these individual little adventures, but like it was all woven into this overarching thing. And I think that they realized they were kind of short-sighted in killing off the Hugh character in the first season. And they decided to just bring him back in the most ridiculous way possible. And then they're like, okay, now you're supposed to care about them again. And it was like, well, he was crazy for like up until the last episode, so it was hard to really care about Hugh, and because we were so invested in Stamets, we're like, why are you being such a dick to Stamets, And I feel like just from a writing perspective that this was just a series of errors in terms of the characters, which brings me to my next topic here, which is like one of the things that made Star Trek The Next Generation, at least in my opinion, begin to break out and was its shift in focus from kind of adventure of the week to character-centric storytelling, where we got entire episodes devoted to different members of the crew, which allowed the audience to really connect more deeply with them. And one of the fascinating things is that the Orville has continued this tradition, especially in season 2, because if you look at season 2, pretty much every episode is a character-centric episode, even like the big action ones. And Discovery has, for the most part, centered around a single central character with a small number of ancillary crew members kind of in their orbit. So what I want to ask you guys is, how do you think the strategy of character-centric versus kind of like more, like main character with minor characters kind of around them and focusing on the greater story has affected each show and how the audience is able to actually relate to the characters? So JP, let's start with you.
Well, I think it's the format of Discovery is really hurting, because there are a lot of characters on Discovery that I'm like, ooh, I want to know more about that person. I want to know more about that person. But because they centralized the show around Michael Burnham, like you said, the other characters are just kind of in her orbit a little bit. And I like Sonequa as Michael Burnham. I don't like Michael Burnham's backstory. I don't like the way the show centralizes everything around her. But I want to know more about Stamets and Culber. I was instantly drawn into those two and was caring about the relationship, but they don't really tell me any stories really where I can get invested into their relationship as much as they would like me to. The Orville, on the other hand, I'm extremely, because they take the time, everybody except for John this season. We didn't really get a John Lamar episode. All the other characters, we really got into their lives, their wants, their needs. So therefore, I think both shows want to have this longevity to be a part of this of a franchise that's going to go on forever and sell lots of stuff and show up at conventions and things like that. But I think Discovery isn't giving people enough to invest themselves into, their hearts into these people, whereas I think the Orville is. So I think it's kind of like an uphill battle for Discovery, I think. But
yeah,
we'll see how season 3 goes.
Yeah, what's interesting about like Discovery is like they actually, in the second season, they actually tried to move away from it's the Michael Burnham show, and like the very first episode of season 2, they bothered to give the bridge crew names. Like I went through all of the first season of Discovery. I was like, I don't know the names of any of these people.
Right.
But then you also have this kind of issue where they revert back to the Michael Burnham show, where Captain Pike is literally taking his cues from everything Michael says for like 90% of the season.
Yeah.
But they did get back to like certain type of character-centric stuff. Like Saru got like a lot of good characterization. Tilly got some stuff, and then they actually tried to flesh out some of the minor crew members. So Nick, do you think that Discovery is kind of trying to go back to that more character-centric stuff and away from like the bigger, like overarching high concept story, or do you think that they're trying to strike a balance between the two? Like, what's your opinion on that?
I think that for season 2, they definitely tried to throttle it back into the more ensemble cast approach. And you're right. Like they set that tone in the very first episode of season 2 with Pike standing there and going around the room and asking everybody what their name was and what they did. I think that they heard loud and clear that people did not like the concept of a single character being the focus of the Star Trek show. Not to say that can't happen, within the realm of TV writing, but her character didn't resonate with fans in the way that they wanted it to. So it left people feeling disconnected from the show when every episode of season 1, especially, was so hyper focused on Michael Burnham that it just left people kind of like distant from what was happening. And I think that they attempted to do a bit of a course correction in season 2 to try to give people more names, literally names. I remember I was doing like a review of season 1 and I was trying to find Detmer's name. And it was actually challenging for me to figure out who that was because they never really say her name at all. So it was like really difficult to figure that out. And so I think that they're trying to strike a balance. My thought is in season 3, they're going to go full blown and make it the ensemble show because they're going to be set so far in the future and they're going to be kind of isolated in whatever environment they're going to be in. Who knows what they're going to be doing, but I think that the focus is going to be on that crew and really fleshing out specifically the bridge crew personnel. Because if you give somebody, number one, a good acting gig and a good writing gig, and you give someone a believable entrance into the show, the character resonates very well with fans. Like look at Tig Notaro's character, Commander Reno, who immediately resonated with fans. I liked her character. I thought she was a fun addition. She's not somebody that needs to carry on a whole episode by herself, but to have her as a supporting character there, she's believable. Like she's relatable. I believe that this character is a person and is someone I can connect to and I can remember her actual name. And so I feel like they're trying to do a balance of that in season 2. And then I believe that they're going to go full blown in season 3 to kind of flesh out all of the characters together. But they made a huge mistake doing the single character thing in season 1. I think that was an idea that Brian Fuller had when he initially pitched the show. And if he was still involved, I think we would have gotten obviously a much different product than what we have right now. And perhaps it could have worked, but because all of that behind the scenes drama occurred and then it was kind of picked up halfway through and then they did a bunch of rewrites to the season 1 and then they were just going to focus it and have Michael Burnham be this spearhead character. And right out of the gate, she was unlikable. She attacked her captain. She caused this huge war. And she was also had this deep connection to Sarek, which is a character we all love. And she was Spock's, adopted stepsister that no one's ever heard of. All of these elements thrown at us all at once was just disconnected everyone from her character. And ultimately,
it's like they set her up to fail.
Yeah.
Right.
I think there are two major story/writing issues at play here. And the first is that Michael Burnham was really kind of like the first Star Trek main character that wasn't a captain. Like in all the other Star Trek series and the Orville to some extent, the show is basically carried by the strength of the commander, the guy who's in charge. You had Kirk, you had Picard, you had Janeway, you had Sisko, you had Archer. You had all these very strong figures who were the guys in command. They were like the shot callers. And with Discovery, they kind of took a step back. It's like, well, she's the first officer. She's not really the shot caller. So it's hard to have her driving the narrative action of the story without undermining the captain. And in the first season of Discovery, the captain was basically the bad guy. And then in the second season, you had a much stronger character with Captain Pike, and he brought a lot to the second season. I thought he was like the highlight of season 2, but he's still kind of like every time a major decision was supposed to be made, Michael was like, we should do this. And Captain Pike's like, yep, do what she said. And I think that
she would have another idea. Then she would have her idea. And then she said, yeah, we'll go with your idea.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Like not having a character who could effectively drive the action forward, I think, kind of hindered the writers in terms of like what they could do with Michael in that. And I think that they're going to set up something like they already kind of set it up with season 3 where Michael could potentially be the captain, which I think would make more sense, even though I like Saru as the captain better. But if you're going to have the main character be Michael, she needs to be the person who's driving the action forward. Otherwise, you're going to have lots of situations where it's like the Michael Burnham show, even though she's not the one in charge. But another thing that I think was an even bigger issue than that was that I feel like, going back to JP's point, where the Orville writers are kind of like a little bit more seasoned, and they kind of come from an older school of writing where you actually take the time to set stuff up and then pay it off. And then you contrast that to the episodes of Discovery, where you basically have these bottle episodes of very heavy emotional manipulation that they're just expecting the audience to kind of fall in line with. A prime example of this was the episode Project Daedalus, where the robotic woman,
Ariam.
Ariam, yes. And keep in mind, like, I didn't even know what her name was before this episode. And I actually thought that she was like a Data-like robot for the entirety of season 2 and the first half of season, or the entirety of season 1 and the first half of season 2, because we don't know anything about her. She just looks like a robot, but she's actually a human who was in a terrible accident, and all of her robotic parts are just augmentations because she was so messed up by, the accident that she got into. But you don't learn any of that until episode 9 of season 2,
where she dies.
And then like when she dies, you're expected to actually like care that she did this, but like until that episode you didn't get to know anything about her. So the emotional payoff that you're supposed to have just isn't there. And when you contrast that with the Orville, where you have their big mid-season kind of set piece, Identity 1 and 2, and in those 2 episodes you have they're basically Isaac's episodes, and you have this scene where Isaac is commanded to kill the doctor's kid. And this is a character that you've seen Isaac connect with not only in season 1, but in the first half of season 2. So like there was actual tension there where you're like, what's Isaac going to do? And then when he chooses to turn on his own people in order to save this kid, because like there's that emotional resonance there, that's so much more of a satisfying emotional payoff as an audience member than it is to have like a single character that like we've seen in the background for like a season and a half, and then we get an episode that she dies and we're supposed to care about that. And I think that that's a real issue with the writing. JP, what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, for instance, first off, Project Daedalus was one of my favorite episodes of season 2 of Discovery. Didn't love it fully, but what you gonna do? That's my preference. That episode was directed by Jonathan Frakes, and I thought they did when I reviewed it, I said I thought they were very successful in getting me to care to a certain degree about Ariam. And then they end up, we get her backstory. We get that she has a group of friends that she hangs out with, and they all have a good time with each other, though she never had a personality prior to this episode. We learned about her history. I thought the death scene was pretty awesome and pretty emotional. And Michael Burnham, sold it. They kept having her face looking into that little window, and
she's very good at crying.
Doing the Michael Burnham face when something's going on. And so I thought it was very successful. But then the very next week, a week later, we have this huge funeral for Ariam, which would make sense if we were, both seasons invested in Ariam. But because we only cared about her in that one episode, during the episode, I really cared about her. But as soon as the episode was over, because it was just, an hour-long episode of my life where I cared about her and nothing before, when we skip a whole week, I've lost all my emotion about her. So I didn't really care about this. It seemed overblown, this funeral. Whereas, but still, I still like that episode. But if the Orville, none of the main cast has died. Even Alara, who's left, she happily left the ship, and it was so emotional. We were completely wrapped up. I think I cried a little bit, and there was no dialogue during her. Way more invested in her because we built her up over a season.
Yeah, Nick, I feel like the Ariam stuff, it was almost like a Tasha Yar level of like, well, this one's dead, time to move on. What do you think about how the writers of the 2 shows handle these emotional setups and payoffs?
So I agree with everything that JP said. I think that I didn't like Project Daedalus as an episode on the whole, but the Ariam character worked for me. I do wish that we had more time to spend with her, and the funeral sequence afterwards was a nice touch, but it was also way overly way overly done for the emotional impact that we as the audience would have to her death. Like, we just kind of learned about her in the previous episode, and it was very sad. And like the death sequence with her, like I remember, like even me watching it, I'm thinking of it now, like when she like finally breaks through the control, controlling her mind, and is like, I have to do this. And it was like this very emotionally intense moment. Like I was like, wow, this is serious, And then I actually thought that they were going to pull it out and they were going to save her, and then they didn't. She actually died. So I thought that was really well done. But I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned earlier, Matt, which was the whole thing with Isaac. And this is kind of goes back to my bigger beef with the Orville as a whole, which is I never felt like there was any possibility at all that Isaac was going to kill anybody of the crew, whether it was the kids, whether it was any of the cast. I never thought that any of those people were ever in any danger. And I also never felt like there was any possibility where Isaac would not turn on his people. They built it up to a degree where there was no other way for them to succeed without Isaac breaking through the control that his other, is it the Kalons, that they put onto him. I never felt that. And to me, that is kind of my beef with the Orville, in that I didn't feel any pressure, because it feels like a story I've already seen, because it's like Robot gets taken back over by his people, or someone is reintegrated back into their society and they have to separate from the group that they've been associated with. And now they're kind of at odds with each other. And then there's some kind of conflict. And then at the end, they wind up all coming back together again, which is a story that has been told before. So to me, I didn't feel any impact on that. Like, it was never like that.
I do agree with you in the sense that with the Orville's kind of predictable, where you kind of know, well, no one's ever really in major danger unless they're going to make a big episode about it. But I feel like even though that Isaac isn't going to kill that kid or whatever, there's this emotional payoff where you're like, wow, he grew as a character. Like he had this turning point where, he's been this kind of machine trying to understand humans. And this was his first real moment where he understood what it meant to have an emotional connection with a character. And I think that mentally and emotionally, that was a payoff that, it's predictable, but when it happened, like, it just felt so good to see it happen as an audience member. And, the hard part about, writing shows like this is that you kind of have to balance expectations. Like, for instance, in the Discovery episode where it looked like Saru was going to die, where he had that thing with his ganglia, and Michael was at his bedside, and you were like, well, I don't think they're going to kill off Saru because he's like one of the best characters on the show.
Right.
So, when all of a sudden, like, he survived that thing, you were kind of like, well, I didn't really get an emotional payoff. I'm glad he's not dead. But I kind of expected it. And as a thought exercise, when going back to Project Daedalus, when what's her name, the robotic chick,
Ariam,
sorry, when she sacrifices herself to kind of keep control from doing its evil thing, I just asked myself, it's like, what would have happened if instead of that character of Ariam, if that was Tilly instead? Mm-hmm. And how would we as an audience have reacted to that death as opposed to what we got? And I think like a character like Tilly, where, she was one of the highlights of season 1, even though like I'm not a big fan of hers, but you definitely have a much stronger emotional connection to Tilly than you do to this character that you don't really know anything about until that episode. And so if Tilly was the one who got, spaced out of the airlock and she died, then I can understand having that emotional reaction, not only as an audience, but from the characters. And so like, I feel like there's this thing where you have to play off expectations versus, emotional setup and payoff in terms of a writer, where you want to deliver to people what they're expecting, but at the same time, you also have to keep in mind what you want them to feel and manipulate the story to do that in the right way. So moving on, let's talk about the overarching way that these seasons are structured. So Discovery and the Orville have taken a very different approach to their seasonal structures. The Orville is a lot more episodic, with only loose connections to a greater season-long arc. And that's a lot like the traditional Star Trek series. Discovery has taken the serialized approach to its narrative, where basically it plays out more like a mini-series or a 13-hour movie. So what I want to ask you guys is, which narrative structure do you think works best for an exploration-based science fiction show, and why? Let's start with you, Nick.
So this is another loaded question for me, because I am tainted by my nostalgic love of the episodic nature that I grew up on with traditional Star Trek. So my desire is to see that on screen. And as much shit as I give the Orville for kind of being a bit predictable, I do appreciate the fact that it still keeps that structure. But in terms of which one is most effective for an exploration science fiction show, I guess it kind of comes down to personal tastes. But I think for an exploration show, I feel like the Orville has the right idea. I think that the episodic format works better for an exploration story. And that's kind of like the other disconnect that I think people had with Star Trek Discoveries, even starting with season 1, which is it's not an episodic exploration. This is a sci-fi drama, and we're telling you this drama story of what's happening in this epic that's going on inside of the Star Trek universe. Because a lot of the people, including myself, complained, especially in the first season, is there's no exploration. There's no away missions. They're not doing anything exploration-wise. And I get that Discovery's mission is different. It's not, it's not the Enterprise's mission, which is to explore strange new worlds, and I get that. But it's a disconnect that people have with what they expect to see. And you can subvert that to a certain degree, but I think the sci-fi drama approach for the very first Star Trek show coming out of the gate after Enterprise was canceled, I think that missed the mark. I think they should have went with an episodic format, and then they could have went with the sci-fi drama show after you kind of reinvigorate the fan base and then give them something new to look at.
I actually think that I liked season 2 of Discovery way more than I liked season 1, and I think that they struck a good balance there of having the overarching kind of season meta arc of the story combined with episodic kind of adventures that tied into that. So I have to give season 2 props because I feel like that was, really well done. JP, what do you think about the episodic versus serialized storytelling?
Well, personally, as far as serializing Star Trek, I think it's a huge mistake. I like the idea of going on a different adventure every week, but then there is looser story arcs that go throughout the whole thing. The first couple episodes of season 2 of Discovery kind of felt more episodic to me because they're going through the different red bursts, and then it eventually just after a couple episodes it all just becomes one big long storyline. So instead of going on 14 episodes, 14 different missions, you're just on one big mission the entire time, and you have to try to figure out the information that you learned from 3 months ago. How does that apply to the final episode? And it's hard to keep everything together. It's like watching a 13-hour movie. Take your most favorite topic and the most well-done 13-hour movie, and it's still going to be a drag a little bit, trying to get through 13 hours of one storyline. So I much prefer the episodic approach where things come back into play. I like the variety of you never know what you're going to get next week, that type of thing. I think it was a huge mistake, and kind of like what Nick said about revitalizing the franchise, the fandom. CBS completely failed at that. I think I've said it many times. They should have had this really great, more traditional style Star Trek show that they came out with maybe on the main channel, and then have all these other Star Trek shows that they're making that have different styles to them, maybe even an anthology series, which I always thought would be an amazing Star Trek type show to have.
Mm-hmm.
Put that all on the app. So get everyone excited on main television with this, the Star Trek that they know and love, but, modernized for today's audiences and today's sensibilities, a 2019 PG-13 as opposed to a, 1990 PG-13.
Right.
Which would be probably rated X at that point. But I think it was just a huge mistake, and it seems like, and you can tell, and I think this is also a problem with Discovery that they're having with it, is they're learning from their mistakes, but they said go. They gave the green light to so many bad ideas that now they're in the middle of these bad ideas, and they have to try to figure out how to fix it after so much stuff has already been done, been shot, been given the go-ahead. So you can kind of see them having to struggle with that throughout the season. But season 3, I don't think is going to have all those problems unless they just make a bunch of bad decisions.
And, if you look at the development of both shows, it's really interesting because the Orville has always had a very strong sense of what it's going to be, where, you had Seth MacFarlane. He's like, I want to do Star Trek. Mm-hmm. So he teamed up with Brandon Braga and a bunch of other old Star Trek guys. And they're like, okay, this is our version of Star Trek. And then you look at something like Discovery, where originally it was going to be an anthology series. You had Brian Fuller kind of come in and, start the ball rolling. And then he got fired and 2 new people kind of took over. And then Alex Kurtzman brought in Akiva Goldsman. And so he kind of started adding stuff to that pot. And the first season of Discovery was just kind of we don't know what this show is going to be yet, but we know that it's on streaming, and streaming people kind of almost expect a serialized 13-hour movie. And then in season 2, they got rid of all the old showrunners, brought in, Kurtzman to kind of handle the first half of the season, and then a new showrunner, the second half. And they started figuring out more about, the kind of story that they wanted to tell. And so I think that Discovery was kind of plagued by a lack of vision, or at least like a strong, kind of
or
central
changing vision.
I don't feel like that, even though Brian Fuller, was a big Star Trek fan and he was involved in Voyager and stuff like that. The people running the show didn't seem to really know much about Star Trek. They were like, I saw the J.J. Abrams movies, and so this is how we're going to approach this. And I think that was kind of Discovery's biggest flaw in its first season was it just didn't know what it wanted to be. And there was no one at the helm who knew what it wanted to be either. Whereas Seth MacFarlane had a very clear vision for what he wanted for the Orville. And I think that's clear when you watch both shows. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about something that's kind of all the rage right now, which is time travel. And, both series have touched on the concept of time travel in their second seasons. And it's always that time travel has always been a staple of elements in Star Trek, but it's also probably one of the hardest things to do well, simply because there's all this possibility for plot holes and paradoxes and, logic flaws and things like that. And that's always the issue with time travel is you have to really think it through. Otherwise, you're going to have people picking it apart for, forever and ever. Discovery chose to use time travel very seriously, and it was an integral part of its second season. But the Orville chose to kind of take a more dismissive view of its nuances. I think you had Captain Mercer at one point say, don't even start talking about time travel or I'm going to eat some glass or something along those lines.
Yeah, it's nobody understands it. Nobody understands it. I'd rather eat broken glass.
Yeah, they kind of they're just we know this doesn't make sense. Don't worry about it. Whereas with Discovery, they're okay, we got time crystals, we got the Red Angel, we got all this stuff happening. But Star Trek has always been kind of like that in the sense that they take their time travel very seriously. You had First Contact. You had numerous episodes of, the various series dealing with time travel. There was this whole temporal civil war in Enterprise. Mm-hmm. So let me ask you guys, which do you feel is the right approach when it comes to time travel? And how must time travel stories be treated in science fiction in order to be a satisfying narrative device for the audience, where you don't have the audience groaning and picking it apart and just sitting back and enjoying it? JP, let's start with you.
Well, I think the most important thing is to make it enjoyable, no matter what rules, because time travel is almost there's time travel rules in the same respect as there's zombie rules. Well, what kind of zombies are we dealing with? We're dealing with slow zombies, supernatural zombies, fast zombies. Time travel is the same thing. And Star Trek has always done time travel throughout all of its series. And I think it also has used different time travel rules for different episodes, different time formats. Discoveries, because I love time travel stuff. I've always been into it. I love wrapping my mind around it. But yes, every time travel story, you have to get acclimated to whatever the rules are for that story. Discovery, it seemed very convoluted to me, what was going on. I had a real hard time tracking it. With the Orville's time travel episode at the end, if you just let it keep going into this, constant spinning logic in your mind. You'll have a lot of questions about it, different timelines being stemmed off from each other, things like that. But they had fun with it, and they also said, hey, don't think too much about time travel because it's very complicated and nobody understands it. So I think them doing that made it so that people really enjoyed that time travel story, as opposed to trying to wrap your head about what's going on in the Discovery time travel thing. Though I like that they attempted it. The visuals I thought were amazing with Michael Burnham at the end, that psychedelic thing. She's going through the wormholes, all that stuff. I was like really enthralled with that. But of course, I prefer the Orville's time travel story because I understood it.
Now, Nick, do you think that Discovery taking time travel so seriously is the right way to treat time travel, or do you think they should have been like a little bit more timey-wimey space magic attitude towards it?
So I think that the Discovery taking it seriously is the right approach. And I think it fits well within the context of Star Trek, as they have taken it seriously, as you mentioned before. They've taken the concept very seriously, and it has had implications throughout all of the different iterations of Trek. And I think that if you can do it right, it's a fun story and can be something that people not only scratch their heads about, but allow their minds to think and about all these different time travel ideas and things of that nature. The problem that I had, and this is why the Orville was kind of like the one-off, like the two-parter thing of the time travel thing, and it was kind of this fun little story about, oh, they didn't go on their second date, and that's what caused all this stuff, and now they are in a post-apocalyptic universe after the Kaylon took over. Like, it's fine, it's, you know, it's self-contained story, it was good enough, like, it was good enough to get these story beats across, and it was fun to see. But that's kind of the thing, is you actually got to see the time travel. And somewhere in the Discovery Season 2 writing, somebody forgot the most fun thing about time travel stories is being able to see the fucking time traveling. Michael does time traveling for like 5 minutes at the end, and all she does is go to the red bursts that we've already seen. The fun thing about friggin' The Voyage Home is them going back and getting the daggone whales and hanging out and talking to people from modern day. The fun thing about even the Enterprise episode where they did the time travel back, and even though it was like an alternate reality thing, and that was kind of like a weird episode where they were back in like the 40s or whatever, where after the Nazis took over America, but you saw the actual time travel, and that's what's fun. Look at Back to the Future. What's fun about Back to the Future, especially Back to the Future 2, is you have not only one Back to the Future movie happening at one time, but then you have this second movie happening at the same time, and they're like sneaking around, and it's like all this fun, like, because you get to rewatch the other movies, and you get to say like, oh, I know that in this scene, the other Marty McFly is behind that truck, and he's waiting to get over here to do this thing, and it's fun, and it's exciting to see the time travel. So taking it seriously is great, but they missed the mark with the actual time travel piece being exciting and being fun. Like every time they teased it, like with her mom, Gabriel Burnham, and we saw that little brief of the episode where she was bouncing around in time and doing different things. Like that was fun to see because you're actually getting to enjoy different outcomes and different realities, and you're on the adventure, the time adventure. But Discovery just dealt with time travel as almost as if like you were in like a college course and somebody was explaining it to you. And it's like I want to go do that. Like I want to go, like you say you saw Michael Burnham die hundreds of times. Well, show me some of that shit. I don't want to just be in this weird thing where I'm separated from it and it's happening over here, and we'll just get Michael in the suit. And you're right, the visuals at the end were great. It reminded me so much of like classic science fiction films. I thought they were really well done, but we just didn't really get to enjoy the fun part of time travel. So that's why everyone spent so much time trying to figure out the red burst thing. And I still don't even understand it because, and maybe you guys can tell it to me, but at the very beginning of season 2, all of the red bursts appeared at the same time, and then they all disappeared except for one. How? Why were all of the bursts there at the same time? It's like they even forgot that they had that in the first episode, and it's never explained. Maybe we'll get that explanation in season 3, but to me, I feel like the red burst story's over with. So
I hope it is.
It's just, so it's like took it very seriously. They kind of missed the mark with the fun part of it, and it was very convoluted. Again, I guess that goes back to that writing, the writing capability.
Yeah, they also kind of fell into the predetermined destiny paradox, which is like, you know, if like one day you wake up, you open your door, you find a book on how to build a time machine,
Right.
And you pick up that book, you build the time machine, you go back in time, and you leave that book on your doorstep to make sure you build the time machine. And it was like when Michael was going back in time and creating these red bursts, it was like, well, she's just going back in time because that's where, up to that point, she encountered these red bursts. Mm-hmm. But how did she know to go to these places to begin with? Like, where does that start? So like, there was never any start to this logic of where they were supposed to go and what they were supposed to save and all this stuff. And I feel like that's the type of thing that as a writer who's writing a time travel story, you need to really think through before you commit to it. Now, I will say that I think season 2 of Discovery did a really good job of kind of tying the whole season together in its finale. Yeah. But there are so many kind of questions and paradoxes that they created that they just kind of glossed over in doing that. And I think that when you're doing time travel, you either have to kind of take the Orville approach and just dismiss it as like being confusing and it's like, just go along with it because it's what we're doing for this episode. Or you have to, really think it through and plan it out and make sure that the audience isn't going to pick it apart, because we all know that the Star Trek audience is very big on being
picking it apart,
like accurate and scientific and stuff. And
well, I mean, we are though, we are like, I have spent an uncomfortable amount of time trying to understand the different timelines and the red burst thing, the paradox of it and how they all appeared initially. And it's frustrating when the basic fundamental of it isn't really there. And we also didn't get to really experience the fun part of time. It's like when you go to the mirror universe, yeah, it's just a fun jaunt into the mirror universe. Everyone's got goatees. Everyone's really mean. It's just fun to watch. It's just a fun little episode to watch. Don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. But they missed that mark, I think.
Well, they kind of missed it a little bit too in season 1 with that mud episode, that time loop episode, which is fun. And it was one of the first episodes where people that weren't enjoying the season, they finally had this episode that they really liked. You see Mud going,
right,
this time loop, and he keeps killing Lorca, all this stuff. But really, the person that was going through that adventure with Mud was Stamets. But Stamets should have been the star of the episode of his struggle through all the different loops to try to stop Mud. But really, it was always about Michael Burnham there, and Stamets keeps coming up to her. So it was still a Michael Burnham episode. And I really think they missed the mark on this great time travel. Star Trek time loop episodes are always a ton of fun. And that was a fun episode. And also that was the episode where I think we were first introduced to time crystals.
Correct. Yeah.
And so that was a lot of fun. So I thought they really, again, messed up the time travel part of an episode by making it all about Michael Burnham, who wasn't traveling through time.
And it is interesting to point out that Harry Mudd was kind of the best character of season 1. His nature, just like being this kind of con manish rogue and stuff like that. Like whenever he was involved in the show kind of came alive. And then once he was gone, you realized what the show was missing, which is something that the Orville does a lot, which is just like having fun. And so like let's talk about that for a minute. So humor has always been a big part of the Orville since its premiere, and I think that probably one of the big hooks that got people to watch it in the first place, because it's
turned them off in the first place.
Or turned them off, but it's it was billed as from the creator of Family Guy. And though the jokiness of the series has kind of slowly been scaled back, it's still present, and there's a lot of like just genuinely funny stuff in the Orville. And by contrast, Discovery has tried to lighten its tone in the second season and incorporate more humor into its narrative, as opposed to its first season where it was just very bleak. So what I want to ask you guys is, how important do you think humor is in sci-fi shows like these, and what is the right way to utilize it in the stories? What do you think, JP?
Well, I think it's very important. Star Trek has always been humorous, as well as serious, as well as scientific, but there's always been humor to it, especially with characters like Data, and or Barclay, things like that. There was funny things that happened. I think Discovery really missed the mark at first, and just like you said, when Mud showed up, and all of a sudden there's this character who's funny and dastardly. People realized what they were missing, and then he was gone, and then the show got super dark again. But then in season 2, they did bring in a little bit of humor. There was a lot of I remember when they released the season 2 trailer for Discovery, and you'd have Tilly say, "That's the power of math, people," or something like that.
Yeah,
and I was just like, "Shut up." But then I saw the episode and in context, and I thought that was a great little moment. It was fun, and it was organic, compared to what was going on in the situation. Lots of little jokes, little Saru jokes here and there. So I think in Discovery, I'll say in Star Trek, humor is important, but just peppered throughout. Nothing too crazy going on. And I thought they did a much better job in season 2 with Discovery, and also going back to character relationships where it's not all dark all the time. They started showing scenes later on in the season of just the crew hanging out, just having a lunch together, just having a good time, and then some serious stuff would happen. So I think the Orville has been very successful on the comedy side of things in season 2, as well as the second half of season 1. Now, I have always appreciated all the comedy of the show, but they had a lot of tonal balance problems the first half of season 1 with the comedy. It seemed like they would write an episode and then have a day where they're like, okay, let's write a bunch of jokes and see where we can put them in there. Whereas, the second half of season 1 and all of season 2, except for certain situations, certain B plots, really the comedy is organic to the situation. For instance, if Bortus and Clyden getting addicted to cigarettes, if that happened to human characters, it would be ridiculous. People would turn it off. There's like, what is this slapstick stuff? But the fact that it happened to 2 aliens because their physiology made it so that they were instantly addicted to nicotine as soon as they were exposed to it, that's just the difference. That's the line that the Orville's able to walk. And I think season 3 of Discovery is going to be much better. They showed a lot of improvement in season 2 of lightening up a little bit. And I think they're just going to carry that forward in season 3. I think season 3 is going to be a very different show.
Nick, how important do you think humor is to Star Trek, and how is it compared to the Orville?
I mean, I pretty much agree with everything that JP just said. I think it's vital. I think Star Trek has always had a decent amount of humor in it, but it wasn't something that people were really looking for when they came to watch the show. They were looking for that more philosophical engagement and fun stories and stuff like that. But because Discovery is so much darker and so much heavier, the need for moments of levity are very, very important. And they obviously didn't do any of that really in season 1. But season 2 really packed it in. I think that they went overboard in some areas. I think that they went overboard in the Tilly character in some cases. I think some of her jokes were forced, but like Saru had like some really great moments. I loved a lot of his moments. Tig Notaro's character, I thought, had really good moments as well. So there was definitely a good attempt on their part to respond to the criticism that the show is being way too serious. I still think that on the spectrum, I think Discovery is still taking itself and the joking stuff, it's too far over to not being fun and not being enjoyable. Well, I think the Orville is too far the other side, where they're not taking things quite seriously enough. There was like one episode of the Orville, I think it was this second season, where they went to the planet with like the zodiac signs. It was like the whole issue with the zodiac signs. And like, I think it was, who were the 2 characters that got stuck on the planet?
It was Kelly and Bortus.
Kelly and Bortus. Yeah. So like they were there for a while, like
over a month.
Time had seriously passed, and they were in this brutal like internment camp situation, and they were in this workforce camp, and they didn't really delve into what that effect had on them, which was essentially the Orville being tied up by bureaucracy and not being able to just go down there and get them, mixed with them actually living in this camp for over a month. And I feel like because the show is a little bit more lighthearted, they weren't able to really get into that too much. So that's why I feel like both shows are a little too far on the fringes, and I think they could both do with sliding closer a little bit further in. I think that JP's right. I think that they're going to increase the jokes and the humor, not like slapstick, but increase the humor in Discovery. And I think as the Orville starts to tackle more of those larger sci-fi but stories and elements, I think the show is going to take itself a little bit more seriously. while still being able to feel relatable and humorous. It's not necessarily like laugh out loud funny, but like I wasn't like busting up a gut when I saw, Bortus and Clyden smoking the cigarettes, but it was humorous and it was a fun idea. Like it was just fun to experience that, and it worked. Like it did work. So that's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah, it's interesting because Star Trek has always kind of been very highbrow in terms of its humor. The humor in Star Trek typically stems from character interaction, where you have Spock and McCoy, and McCoy's like, "You're out of your Vulcan mind," and like there's just that conflict there of having the crotchety old doctor and the uber logical science guy kind of butting heads. And I feel like with the Orville, the humor is actually a lot jokier, and it's more situational. Like the whole thing about them trying to teach Isaac about humor, and Isaac basically amputates Gordon's leg.
Right.
And
Isaac went too far.
He did. He took it way too far. You're not invited to the party, bro.
But that's a good situational thing, example of humor. And then you have stuff where, and Captain Mercer does this a lot, where it's basically just like a really quippy line, like in that episode where the Zodiac episode, he gives this speech and they were like, "That was a great speech." He's like, "Thanks. I like plagiarized it from like 4 different sources." So you have like this kind of jokier situational humor with the Orville, and it's not quite the same type of humor we've come to expect from Star Trek, especially Discovery. And I thought it was actually very interesting where, JP mentioned when the season 2 trailer for Discovery came out, it was almost like they were trying to mimic the Orville in that trailer, in the sense that they were like, "Hey guys, look, we're lighter and funnier." And then like the Orville's kind of going in the opposite direction, where it's like, "Well, we're a lot more serious and epic," Nick talked about them bringing both shows in. I feel like that's pretty much what's happening, is that they're trying to make Discovery more like the Orville, and the Orville's trying to be more like regular Star Trek. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy there. But let's talk about the special effects of these two shows and the overall production design. Because Discovery, I gotta hand it to these guys. They were really impressive for a TV series. Like just the production design, the cinematography, the special effects, like it's movie quality on there. And in comparison, the special effects for the Orville are just like, they look so cheap and low budget in comparison. But both series have pretty epic space battles, such as the Orville's Identity Parts 1 and 2, which was the big 2-parter, and Such Sweet Sorrow 1 and 2, which was the season finale for season 2 of Discovery. But episode to episode, Discovery just blows away the Orville in terms of production value. So what I want to ask you guys is, how important are the quality of special effects in these shows, and what role does the production value have to play in the look and feel of the two series? But more importantly than that, how does that look and feel affect the audience and how they experience the show? So Nick, what do you think about that?
So trying to put myself in the shoes of someone who's just a regular viewer, because like for me, like when I watch these shows, I'm looking for certain things, I whether I'm reviewing the episodes or whatever it is, like I pick up on things that a regular viewer may not want. We all would probably pick up on those things because we care a lot about this stuff. So as a regular viewer, I feel like the Orville is a passable thing because it's on, cable television. It's just a science fiction show about fun stories, about gallivanting around the cosmos. So I think it's a passable effects in terms of special effects and practical sets, the actual sets. I think that with Discovery, it's a mind-blowing adventure for people who are looking for the flash, looking for the detail, looking for all of that great special effects look to it. I think it's just a wonderful sight for the eyes. I think it's overwhelmingly beautiful. I think that they, as much as shit as we can all give the writers and the actual producers and the story runners and stuff like that, the production staff and the visual effects folks really knock it out of the park for Star Trek Discovery. So I think that it's really great and helps elevate the show almost to the point where it's elevating itself and kind of picking up the story and carrying it on its back in some areas, in some instances. The issues that I kind of have are the Orville special effects, I feel like, are good, but at the same time, they're a little too cartoonish in nature. And I talk about like the space battles specifically is it's just lasers just quickly firing, and there's like kind of like a cartoonish effect. And the ships themselves move almost as if the ship is this big and not this big. And so like the weight of certain things, and I noticed that during the two-parter, like with the major Kalon battle outside of Earth and on the moon, like it was almost overwhelming with how many ships there were. And it felt a little too cartoonish with how everything was kind of like zipping around and everyone was moving so quickly. One of the things that I liked about like Such Sweet Sorrow at the end of the Discovery season 2 was I liked how slow as hell the Discovery and the Enterprise were moving, because obviously space and space battles, we don't really know exactly how that would look, but it feels like these ships have weight to them. And it would take, like when they do a course correction, it takes a while for them to kind of move, as opposed to all the little ships that are going super fast, zipping around them. So comparing the two there, I feel like the visual effects department is something that lacks for the Orville as opposed to Discovery, which, I guess it's just kind of plus and minuses as you go through the different production departments on the shows.
JP, how do you feel the look and feel of these shows affects the audience's enjoyment of them?
Well, I think both shows look very different. I like the effects on both of them. Of course, Discovery does have that movie look to it. I mean, a lot of that comes from the lighting, rendering, stuff like that. It just, you can see the sheen of, the sun reflecting off the metal, things like that. It looks amazing. To me, it doesn't feel like Star Trek to me, but it does look amazing. The Orville, I think the special effects on both shows match the look of both shows. For
That's a good point. Yeah.
Like when Nick was talking about the weight of, the Enterprise and Discovery and space moving around, because the shows are heavy, right? So then you think
the shows are heavy.
because the show is heavy. The Orville, it's a lighter show, so everything is lighter, shinier, brighter. The ships, I think their idea is they want to have these huge ships, which they are huge, but they want them to be advanced enough where it's almost like you can have a dogfight in space, like their jets or something like that. But as far as, I like the effects of both, but I don't think they're as important to the audience in the long run. Because, for instance, if you have a gigantic TV, if you have a small TV but a really nice audio system, you're getting, in your brain, you're getting just as much enjoyment out of something as opposed to having a giant screen and a horrible sound system. So I think as long as the stories are good, the effects aren't as important, but Discovery does look great. I mean, come on. But also, as far as longevity goes, you have to be able to have enough money to keep producing a show. So I think they actually could afford to pull back a little bit, save a little bit of money, maybe put that into the writing staff.
And it is interesting that Discovery is a much more expensive show than the Orville.
Yeah. And I think it's dangerous for it.
Yeah, I think it's like $8 million an episode, something around those lines.
That's the figure that's online. Obviously, they're never gonna, as of right now, tell us.
But
that's the figure.
It's one of the more expensive shows on TV, and I think it's because they're going for that J.J. Abrams big budget Star Trek look. But one of the things I also want to kind of touch on here is that what I find very interesting is that the look and feel of the show kind of makes the audience like more critical or more lenient on it. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the Orville, okay, it's very like brightly lit. It kind of looks cheap, like it looks like a TV show,
right?
And when the Orville does stupid stuff, the audience is going to forgive it for being stupid because it's cheap. Like what I mean by this is that, there was an episode of the Orville where they hide the ship in the event horizon of a black hole.
Yeah, right.
And they fly out of it, and then they can't the ship can't take the pressure of, going under the Marianas Trench. And anyone with like a high school knowledge of, astronomy and black holes and stuff like that knows that, you don't just fly into an event horizon and fly right out after hanging out in there for a little while. But when I was watching that episode, I was like, are you fucking kidding me? But then I was like, but wait, it's the Orville. Like if Star Trek had tried to do something like that, we're like, oh, we're going to hide in the event horizon of a black hole and then we're going to fly out of it. Like you'd have a riot of 40 million Star Trek fans across the globe because people just hold Star Trek to a much higher, I think, standard in terms of how it handles the science and stuff like that. And because the Orville looks kind of like cheap and goofy and stuff like that, audiences are willing to forgive these types of like blatant violations of physics and science and stuff because it's like, well, it's the Orville, who cares?
Well, even with Discovery, what about when the ship is going into when they're going to do a spore drive jump, and they do that weird cartoony spin all of a sudden, like it's a Tasmanian devil.
You're right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, what you're saying there, JP, too, is like they tried to introduce some magic spores and it does a magic thing to the ship, it makes it do something that we've never seen before, which also I think provided for some disconnect with season 1 because they used it nonstop in season 1. And so it was also like, this is not what I'm used to seeing. I want to see a slow pan shot of the ship going by with little stars shooting by. Like it's what I want to see because that's what I'm used to. But I did want to say to your point, JP, about like the small television thing, which the effects of Discovery are great, but the effects of Star Trek have never been that impressive, and they don't stand the test of time. And the effects of Discovery, the physical props, I think will stand much longer, but like the digital effects will eventually become dated. In a few years, we'll look back at season 1 and say, I can't believe we thought that was cool because that looks like shit.
Babylon 5.
Babylon 5, So the thing is the stories themselves and the characters and the franchise is what has allowed the franchise to move on for 50 years. And why people can still, including myself, turn on an episode of the original series. I'm not sitting there looking for, the special effects. I'm there for the story and the characters. So, Discovery is getting by right now with the benefit of having really great effects, but eventually that's going to run out. And then it also affects people's desire to want to watch the show 10 years from now. Like who's going to want to watch Discovery 10 years from now if the stories are terrible and the effects just look now dated? So relying on that too much is definitely a bad thing. And I think that they're doing that a little bit right now. And hopefully I think the writing's going to get better as we go through the season 3 and stuff like that. But as of right now, like if you were to send this DVD or Blu-ray box set 10 years into the future, I feel like most people, however many seasons there are of Discovery, probably would skip season 1 because the stories and the characters were just not there. And they don't care how the effects look or what the props look like. They're just going to skip it, watch the 10-minute recap, and then move on to the rest of the season that they liked. Whereas the rest of us can sit there and watch any of the older episodes of Star Trek because the episodes themselves were really, really well done. Instead of skipping whole seasons, we would skip maybe a few episodes that we don't like or whatever it is. But the effects wasn't what was keeping us there to go watch.
Yeah, I mean, look at the original series. The effects in that are, terrible, but
right,
stories and the characters are there.
Yeah,
that's what the people fall in love with. And I think that's one of the benefits that the Orville has is that because they've focused so much on getting you to care about these characters, and they've actually like had some really compelling stories, like the audience for the Orville just doesn't care about the stuff like the production value and the special effects, even though for the show's budget, which I think is around $2 million an episode, like they stretch that penny really well. Don't you think so, JP?
Well, yeah, it's just like Nick said. The effects on either show, good or bad, is not what's keeping me there. And when I think of the Orville, when I think back on the Orville, I'm not thinking about any of the effects scenes. I'm thinking of the stories, the plots, the characters. Yeah. Same thing with Discovery. I'm not thinking about the effects. I see them on screen, but as soon as it's gone, I'm not thinking about it anymore. And I always find myself thinking to myself, oh, I don't want to rewatch this episode. I don't want to rewatch this story. I'll rewatch some old Star Trek or the Orville or something like that. So I think that is a big problem that Discovery has with it right now is rewatchability.
Mm-hmm. Yes, 100%.
But what's really ironic about this whole thing is that even though Discovery looks amazing, its advanced special effects have been part of the big criticism that fans have had with it because it is set, in the timeline 10 years before the original series. And so you have stuff like holographic projections and, you know, like all this other stuff that wasn't in the original series. And so people are like, yeah, it looks great, but it doesn't fit with, you know, kind of like what we've come to know from this period of time. Nick, do you think it's a fair criticism to say like, well, yeah, it looks great, but we don't want it to look great?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a fair criticism. I've said many times that, again, they sat in this friggin' CBS boardroom and somebody said, we need to make a new Star Trek show. And what do they want? Well, people like those Kelvin movies because they made a bunch of money, regardless of people's actual reaction to them. They made money, like they made good money. Well, let's do something TOS because people know TOS. They know Kirk. They know Spock. They know what that looks like. Well, okay, but we can't make it look like it's the 60s. Well, we'll freshen it up. And then we'll do this. And then we'll do that. And it'll just be working. And CBS just wanted it all. And they thought that people were going to be okay with them refreshing the visuals and also trying to pull in that giant nostalgia cookie of, hey, this is during the Kirk and Spock era. And I think it's a fine criticism to have on the show because they didn't need to do it. And that's my beef. People saying, well, it needs to look like the 60s. No, it doesn't need to look like the 60s. They want to update it. They want to update it. My beef is even before that, which is they should have never put the daggone show in the TOS era to begin with.
Yeah,
and
move forward.
They only did it to themselves because they thought that would ensure people would return out because somebody in that boardroom meeting thought, well, if we set it too far in the future, no one's going to tune in because they don't know any of these characters, which is just goes to show how much they don't really understand the fan base. Because everyone I've ever talked to has always said they wanted to see a show in the future. Set it so far in the future that it doesn't matter. Whatever you do wouldn't even matter because it's 1,000 years in the future. You can do whatever you want, which ironically is where they're at now because they finally said, well, this was a terrible idea. Everybody doesn't like it being in this situation. And we keep writing ourselves into canon breaking corners. So let's just put it, they literally I feel like they wrote the entirety of season 2 as a way to undo the damage they did in season 1 and to get the show 950 years into the future where it should have been to begin with. So I think it's a fair criticism because they should have never done it to begin with. That's me though.
It's interesting because, you know, in the final 2 episodes of season 2 with Discovery, we get to see an updated version of the Enterprise bridge. And I feel like the show did a really good job of kind of modernizing that classic Enterprise, you know, bridge set on there. And I feel like if they had done that kind of throughout the first 2 seasons of Discovery, where they were more respectful to canon, but they kind of like updated the kitschy designs a little bit, fans probably would have by and large accepted it. But because everything felt like it was so far beyond, you know, the next generation time period in terms of technology, that it was confusing to people, and people kind of rebelled against that. And in a way, it's kind of interesting because you think about the Orville, they had carte blanche to do whatever the heck they wanted in terms of visual style and design. And they chose a very kind of conservative, traditional Star Trek look and feel to it. Mm-hmm. And Star Trek was like, no, we're going to go like big budget Hollywood blockbuster look and feel, despite the fact that we're setting this movie in between Enterprise and the original series.
Yeah, it's you're right to say that the way that they updated the NCC 1701 bridge should have been the way that they updated the Discovery to begin with, because it kept enough of the visual cues to show that you were on the same ship. Like anyone who's familiar with the TOS look of the bridge, and you showed them the one that they just did for, you know, Discovery, would be able to tell you that there are visual similarities to the point where if I said to that person, this is the same bridge but updated, they would be like, oh, okay, I can see the connections. You can clearly see that they worked to actually update it, which is, again, props off to the, you know, the props department and the art department and all those guys and gals who actually bothered to put all that stuff together. But because, like, when you step onto the Discovery Bridge, it's like this sleek, sexy thing, and there's holographic things everywhere, and it's this big, giant bridge, and it's like, this feels so far from what anything could have possibly looked like at this era. It's just mind-numbing, and everyone's wearing different uniforms, and all this stuff looks different, and now they have a spore drive, and you're telling me, and they're sitting there saying, no, this is for sure prime timeline, 10 years before Kirk and Spock, and it's like, are you sure? Because it doesn't seem like that.
Yeah.
It seems like you wrote a future show and then someone was like, no, put it in the past, and you didn't change anything. So it was very frustrating, I think, and a fair criticism of the show for them, because they put it in the TOS era. They didn't need to do that.
Yeah, let me ask you guys, JP, what did you think of the creation of this mycelial network? Because this was like something that was created specifically for Discovery to kind of like make the ship, I guess, different from all the other ships that came before it. But I think out of all the original ideas that Discovery has kind of come up with, the mycelial network, which is this like subatomic, like fungal network that connects everything, it's kind of like midi-chlorians of the Force.
Yeah, magic.
Yeah, like, what did you think of that introduction into Discovery? And do you think it was a good addition that they can kind of go places with, or do you just think it was stupid?
Well, I wouldn't say it's stupid. I think it's absolutely horrible for this show. I mean, the mycelial network, a spore drive type thing on some other franchise that they're going to create would have been great, but the fact that they're putting it in that era of Star Trek it just cannot be. They cannot have that. And it seems like magic. They keep trying to do this science stuff with it. When we met that mycelial, I can't remember what her name was, took the form of Tilly's friend, and we went to the other side of the looking glass, which is exactly what they were trying to do. Give us that Alice in Wonderland type of thing. When we went to that, so we're talking to basically a spore, and the spore tells Tilly, "I really like how good at science you are. I like your science." And then Tilly's like, "I like your science too." And then it's like, "No, you're just talking to some spores. That's not science. That's magical mushroom type stuff." So it does not fit at all for me. Now, if it took place further down the timeline, way in the future, way past Voyager, and if they discover it, maybe they discover this spore drive that some alien race has, and they're able to figure out how to make one of their own. That is a different situation, which I think could have worked. I just don't know if at this point. See, the problem was, for me with CBS, this is their first Star Trek show, in my opinion. This isn't Paramount making Discovery. Paramount, it's proven they know how to do Star Trek, even slightly different forms of Star Trek. This seems like CBS, we now have Star Trek, let's make our own Star Trek type of thing. So I think they just made too many changes. It has to look modernized. I mean, no matter what era it takes place in, it has to look modernized. On accident, if you just get a home video camera and start shooting something, it's going to look better than the original, stuff, because our world is just much more advanced. When in the very first episode of season 2, when Captain Pike and his crew beam aboard Discovery, all of a sudden I'm like, oh, that looks like Star Trek. They just came over from Star Trek. They beamed over from Star Trek. All their
crossover episode.
yeah, pretty much. There's they look different, but it looks like it stemmed from classic Star Trek. It looks like a modernization of classic Star Trek. So I think that's it doesn't feel like Discovery takes place in the same universe.
Yeah, what's interesting is I didn't really start enjoying season 2 of Discovery until I was like, this isn't Star Trek. Like, this is just another science fiction show that has Star Trek elements in it, but I'm just going to enjoy it for what it is, as opposed to trying to, get it to fit with, my view of canon and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's what I did too.
As soon as I did that, I started enjoying the show much more than if I had kind of held on to that, like, this is not Star Trek, or this is Star Trek type mentality. Nick, what did you think of the mycelial network and the spore drive and stuff like that?
If only Star Trek, the universe, had a clandestine organization that has access to untold technology, operates beyond the purview of anything we've seen before, who could have definitely benefited from the possibility of using a device known as the spore drive to get around the galaxy at rapid pace to stop things from happening. That would have worked really well. If only Star Trek had such an organization. You could have called it a section, I don't know, I'm pulling a number out of my hat here, 31, perhaps. I don't know. I just think that the spore drive ultimately wasn't necessary. I think it was a really lame plot device. I think they could have just given it to Section 31. That would have been cool, because then you could at least, yeah, it's super advanced and makes no sense, but it's like, well, it's Section 31. We don't know anything about that. You know, who knows what they've got? They've got all cool toys. We don't know what's going on over there. We know regular fleet ships don't have that stuff. And ultimately, the whole point of the spore drive was literally just so that they could do 200 consecutive jumps and get friggin' Lorca back into the mirror universe, which is so ridiculous because we've fallen ass backwards into the mirror universe so many other times. Why they needed to have this whole plot. The spore drive was literally there to support the other plot that they created, which was Lorca was this guy from the mirror universe, and he just wanted to get back home. And it was like bizarre. It was unnecessary. I didn't like it. I feel like once they understood, number one, that the spore drive was hurting Stamets to use, I feel like at the end of season 1, they were like, we're not going to use the spore drive ever again because it still uses a human interface and it hurts people. Okay, that makes sense. And I get that. But then in the season 2, like the first, like one of the second or first red bursts, I think it's the second red burst is like, you know, would take them like 20 years or some crazy nonsense. It would take many years to get there by warp. So they were like, oh, we'll just use to New Eden. They were just like, well, we'll just use the spore drive. It's no big deal. And then they found out that not only is it hurting Stamets, not only that, but the mycelium network has a consciousness and is aware of things. This is now a being that you are jeopardizing just because you want to zip around the cosmos. And to me, that goes against the ethos of what Starfleet is, which is this is a sentient life form. It's not even, at first it was like magic, and then they tried to overlay science on it. But then it became like they were utilizing an alien species and an alien's way of traversing the cosmos for their own benefit, and even damage them and hurt them in a lot of ways. So the fact that they continue to use it is like, that just, to me, it's like, why would you guys keep doing that? It goes against what Star Trek and Starfleet stands for. This is the same franchise where you had Captain Jean-Luc Picard say, we're going to try to talk to the crystalline entity after it wipes out planets wipes out life by the planet load. It just consumes whole species for dinner. And he's like, we got to talk to it. And we've got to try to make amends and see what's going on, because this is a sentient species. This is the same franchise. I understand that they're different characters. I understand they're different writers. I understand that. But this is the legacy of the show that you're going with. And to sit there and say like, oh, we're just going to keep doing it anyways, even though we clearly know that it's affecting a sentient species of people, or not people, but of whatever, spores, they're just going to keep doing it, even though it causes risk to not only humans, but to them. And it's like, well, we got to get away from control. Like, it doesn't matter.
Interesting thing is like the Enterprise crew, or the Discovery crew, continues to use the spore drive despite the fact that they know that it's causing damage to the mycelial network. It's like as soon as they set that up, they're like, oh, that's terrible. But then the writers kind of forget about it.
Yeah, they drop that storyline.
Yeah, they totally drop it. And that's just, I feel like that's a greater kind of symptom of lazy writing, which seasons 1 and 2 of Discovery definitely suffered from to varying degrees. When I first was watching season 1, I thought that this new drive of theirs, that could have been, any type of drive really, but it was the MacGuffin to kind of get the ship to jump into different dimensions, like going into the mirror universe, going into, different universes. And that's what Discovery thing was, is they were discovering entirely new, like, multiverse planes of existence, where like they're even worse than Voyager, because like their universal translator doesn't work on like, these different dimensional beings, or, they're going through different timelines and stuff like that. And because they're not from the original Star Trek timeline or Star Trek universe, that explains all the differences in the technology and stuff like that. And I feel like the show had the potential to kind of bypass all these problems that it suffered from, just from a simple narrative choice that for whatever reason, the showrunners decided not to go with. What do you guys think of that?
I agree with what you're saying. I think that the idea of doing a kind of Quantum Leap style show where the Discovery utilizes the spore drive, even if they started it in the Prime universe, whatever, like forget the Klingon War, all of that nonsense. They just turn on the spore drive and it just zaps them into the mirror universe. And then they try to use it again. And then it takes them to another universe and then another one. And then you're right. Now you're getting a show that is able to take a unique spin on the concept of exploring the strange new galaxies and, strange new worlds and all this stuff like that, and seeking out new civilizations. You're taking a unique concept of, instead of doing it just in our galaxy, we're going to do it in multiple different timelines and different universes and different perspectives, galaxies. And I think that would have been a great idea. And for a show that's $8 million supposedly an episode, I think they could have afforded to have that done. And I think it was just a huge missed opportunity. I think the fact that they didn't utilize it in that fashion, again, goes back to what we were all talking about earlier, which is just a lack of vision from the showrunners, because they changed hats so often. The writers were all over the place. There was a lack of vision, I think, from what they really wanted to do. And it almost got to the point now where they had like kind of a messy first season, and then they wrote the entire second season to undo and get themselves out of that situation and get themselves into the future and super far away from any of these other problems, and I don't think it's a coincidence in my mind that when Alex Kurtzman took full control of the show, especially for season 2, and he was starting to plan that out with his writing team, his experiences probably dealing with the Kelvin movies and all of the bullshit that goes along with upsetting canon and all that stuff like that for those movies, he probably didn't want to keep the show in the TOS universe where all this canon stuff is a problem. He probably wanted it to be in the future. So I'm not saying we have to thank him for that, but I definitely feel like it was a deliberate attempt on his part to undo what had occurred in the first one, get away from all of those problems, and get us into the future where they can do whatever they want. It's a blank slate. And then they can use the spore drive however they want to, because they still have it, obviously. But I think, yeah, that's how I think about that.
All right. So, getting into canon issues here, the biggest criticism Discovery has received comes from how it handled, the canon of the previous Star Trek shows that has already been established. And now, in contrast to that, the Orville doesn't have any of this baggage, and they can pretty much do whatever they want without having to worry about contradicting itself. So what I want to know from you guys is, why do you think the people currently running Star Trek keep putting themselves in positions where they have to destroy established canon and anger hardcore fans by setting movies and series in the past time periods, as opposed to moving forward in the timeline where they wouldn't be constrained by canon issues? And in addition to that, why do you think the current writers of Discovery have never properly established its current timeline in relation to the Prime or Kelvin timelines, and allowed the fan base to just be confused for the entire first and second season of the show? JP?
I don't know why they've done this to themselves. And I mean, I think originally it has to do with just this team didn't understand. They didn't understand what they were jumping into. And they didn't seem to try to want to understand the universe that they were trying to create, and everything that came before it. And there was just been so many choices that they've made that they did not have to make, and that the payoff wouldn't have been big enough for them to suffer the hate that's coming at them from longtime fans. But also, I will say, I know very long-time hardcore. They know every, the ins and out of every Star Trek episode there is. I know those types of fans who absolutely love Discovery. So I just don't think they're in the majority as far as old school fans go. But they just keep making these weird choices. The Klingons was a weird choice. The spore drive was a weird choice. The fact that Starfleet just doesn't seem to have the values of Starfleet is a weird choice. And I think that's the first thing you notice when Pike shows up, is he starts acting like Star Trek. He starts saying, no, this is what we stand for. This is what we believe in. This is how we treat people. And I think that was directly because they realized they didn't have that. And that was a huge complaint people were having. I don't get it. I don't know if it's just because it's a corporate machine that wanted to turn the on switch back up on Star Trek. I don't know if it's just they hired the wrong people. They're giving the go ahead to things they probably shouldn't give the go ahead to. I can't explain it. It's an anomaly, which is a very popular Star Trek trope.
Nick, why do you think they made the decisions that they made in terms of contradicting canon and not being clear about, what timeline the show took place in?
So here's what I think that the press releases and the interviews and the junkets and the conventions and all that jazz, they are very clear that this show is prime. That's in the prime timeline. This connects to all the other shows. That's what they want to say. Visually, I believe that they are borrowing a lot of the visual cues and some of the prop designs and all of those things from the Kelvin stuff, because that was the most recent iteration of Trek prior to Discovery. I think that they're doing that to try to bring in some of the fans of the films that may not know about the previous 50 years of Star Trek, to try to get them to think like, oh, is this part of the movies that I went to go see a few years ago? I don't know. Let me turn it on and let me check it out. I think that ultimately failed. So I think that was a really bad choice. I think that Discovery messing with canon in Star Trek, my personal feeling is Star Trek has always been kind of wonky with its own canon and continuity, with different types, specifically like different types of technology and different types of interactions with people, like from simple things like, sometimes you can beam through the shields, it's not a problem, and other times it's a big problem. Discovery does the same thing. Star Trek has had issues with canon in the past. I think it's disingenuous to say that it's not an issue that Trek has plagued. I mean, it's a franchise that's had so many iterations of itself, and it's 50 years old. It's going to have inconsistencies. I think that's just par for the course. But a caveat to that is we now live in an MCU-laden Earth, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And why does that connect to Star Trek? It's because people, when you have a shared large franchise, a shared large universe, people are now used to these things having perfect connections with each other. Almost perfect connections. The MCU is almost perfectly connected in every single, whether it's the TV shows or the movies, these things, they work really hard to make sure everything fits as well as it possibly can together, even though you're dealing with all these different characters, all these different production teams, all these different directors. They do a really great job at that. So I think audiences have this expectation of what connections are going to be made for shows and movies now. So when you look at it at that lens and it goes into Star Trek Discovery, where it doesn't exactly line up with what you're expecting to see, not only from tone, but from scripting to the characters, the way they're acting, and the visuals, it all feels like it's disjointed from what you're expecting. And because people want those connective lines now, I feel like audience members really want those lines. I feel like it seems like it's overwhelmingly breaking from canon because of what we wanted to see, and also this kind of MCU lens that people have. That's how I feel about it.
Well, I think it's there's a little bit of a difference between not exactly lining up, which you can't expect anything to exactly line up. There's just there's too much of a universe to try to, even with MCU, it's not perfect, but at least they're trying really hard to make it as perfect as possible, which I don't think is a requirement for Star Trek Discovery. But some of the choices they've made are so far away from even coming close to aligning that it's just weird. It's I don't understand why they would make the Klingons so incredibly different as opposed to just a little bit different.
I agree with what you're saying there, and I would say that it was a bad choice. Specifically, the Klingons were a bad choice to the point where they've now almost retconned the look of their Klingons like about 80%. Like I did like a video a while back where I looked at the differences between Laurel season 2 and Laurel season 1, and she looks like you're telling if it wasn't the same actress and they kept telling me that was Laurel, I would have no idea that was the same person. She looks completely different.
Yeah,
completely different. From everything, from the nose prosthetics to the necks to the lips, everything looked like, even in this last episode that she was in, they dropped the big lips completely. And I made a video about like how the props department, well, did really good, but like you could tell like the lips were separating from her regular lips were separating from the prosthetic lips. Mm-hmm. And it just looked weird. And they just dropped all of that shit. So, right, like they did weird things with that. They did weird things with the war storyline, which was really bizarre, like how this whole thing led to the destruction of a third of Starfleet, and how, like there was like 10 Klingon ships that were about to destroy Earth, and it's like, this doesn't align with what I know about Star Trek. They've had those problems in the past, even with Star Trek Generations, where the Enterprise B was the only ship in range to save those 2 ships from the energy ribbon at the beginning. Please, you're not even to Pluto yet. There's thousands of starships in the area. Don't give me that. So they've had that problem before, but again, I feel like all of the additional elements, when you add them all together, it really created a huge disjointment for longtime Trek fans, which is why I think a lot of people really, really felt that huge canon disconnect. I think a lot of those other elements added and attributed to that reaction.
And in addition to that, and to get to something JP said about corporate interference, Star Trek has a lot of like baggage attached to it that something like the Orville doesn't. Seth MacFarlane has a very clear vision for the Orville. He's the executive producer. He's basically the shot caller on that thing. And so the Orville is a reflection of how he wants his show to go. But with Star Trek, you have a lot of different kind of cooks in the kitchen, because not only do you have like CBS, who they're kind of more the mandating in terms of like the licensing stuff. Like the Klingons have to look different because we already have the licensing for these other shows. And if they're too similar to, what came before it, we can't create a new license. There would be brand confusion. So like they have to mandate certain things. And then at Discovery's kind of inception, you have Brian Fuller, who's a very kind of auteur type, TV producer, where like it's his show, it's his vision, and he gets fired from pretty much every show he does because he's like so, stringent with how he wants to do things that he butts heads with the money people and the studio people a lot of times. And, he had a very specific vision for how he wanted to do Discovery, which CBS initially signed off on. But then Les Moonves comes in when he was running CBS, and he's like, no, it's gotta look fancy. Modern audiences want this type of stuff. You have to have everything be 25% different from our other licenses and stuff like that. And then, as Brian Fuller is going out the door because he's just, butting too many heads and he's going over budget and stuff like that, they bring in Gretchen and Berg as the new co-showrunners. And throughout all this, Kurtzman is just kind of like tangentially involved. Like he's not really paying much attention to it because he's over making The Mummy and trying to do the Dark Universe thing.
That worked out great.
Yeah. But basically Berg and Akiva Goldsman and Gretchen all kind of were responsible for, what happened in the first season, where they were trying to appease their CBS masters, but at the same time, they were butting heads over like creatively where to take the show. And I think you had this purge at the end of the first season where Akiva Goldsman kind of stepped aside, and then Gretchen and Berg did the first couple episodes and then got fired. And that required Kurtzman to kind of step in. And Kurtzman had his full attention on Star Trek because his deal at Universal blew up. And then he's like now going off to do the Picard show and a bunch of other Star Trek shows. And now we have Michelle Paradise, who I don't know much about, but supposedly she's like a big Star Trek fan. So like under her leadership, we might get like a better vision of what Star Trek is supposed to be.
I think she wrote the Project Daedalus episode. I think
she did, and she wrote the 2 season finales, Sweet Sorrow 1 and 2, I believe. So like we've kind of gotten a taste of what we can expect from her, and it's not bad. I wouldn't say it's quite where it needs to be, but then again, she kind of came in and was handed this mess and had to, kind of
she was dancing in their wheelhouse. Like she had to. We haven't gotten a full taste of her capability yet. For
now
sure.
With season 3, you basically got a blank slate. So now, we're going to get to see, how she handles things from there. But moving on, what do you guys feel are the biggest challenges facing the Orville and Star Trek Discovery going forward? And what would you say is the biggest criticism from the fan base for each series, and do you agree with that criticism? JP?
With the Orville's doing really well. I guess their first obstacle is to get officially renewed for a 3rd season.
Yeah, that's true. That's a big challenge.
Yeah, when it comes to the Orville, I think just staying the course, staying the path that they're on. I think they understand how to evolve the show. They listen to the fans, but also they are fans of the genre. So I think they're doing a great job. One criticism, I guess, now there's always that criticism of a certain portion of the audience where they don't like the comedy. They're like, oh, Star Trek didn't have this much comedy. I'm like, well, this isn't Star Trek. This is the Orville. So that's a criticism I don't listen to, because the show has proven that it's really gotten good at the balance, and it keeps getting better and better with the comedy / drama balance. One criticism that people have with season 2, and I don't agree with it, but I understand it, is too many Mocklins.
There were a lot of Mocklin.
There were a lot of Mocklin. Yeah, that's true.
And I think part of that had to do with the first 2 episodes being Mocklin stories, and but they just couldn't have gotten away with that because episode 2, Primal Urges, was the carryover from season 1. They weren't able to get the effects done, so it got carried over. That was a season 1 episode, and they reshot some stuff with Topa, and they put it in season 2. I thought it would have been served better if it was placed somewhere else, not right next to the season 1 opening, which was Jaloja, or season 2 opening, which was Jaloja, a Mocklin story. It's not officially called Jaloja, a Mocklin story, but you get it.
I like that title, though.
Yeah, but I went through it. Every single episode, I'm like, there's nowhere else they could have placed that episode. And I think they realized that they didn't really want it there either as the second episode, but they couldn't put it anywhere else because the look of the show changes, the uniforms change, personnel changes right after that. So they had to put it there.
But there were a lot of, subplots that had to deal with Mocklin stuff as well throughout the season.
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel it was more like Bortus and Clyden character stuff. If you take Deflectors, which was the Lokar episode, I wouldn't say it was necessarily a Mocklin episode, just like the Bortus episodes aren't Mocklin episodes. They just happen to be characters that are Mocklin. The Mocklin episodes, I think, would be like Sanctuary, where we're dealing with how horrible the culture on Mocklus is, type of thing. Otherwise, I just consider them to be Bortus and Clyden stories, which are just characters on the ship stories. But B plots is one thing. You get a lot of comic relief with those Mocklins. So I think the problem with Primal Urges, which was the one where Bortus has his, sexual escapades aboard the environmental simulator, is the simulator stuff was the A plot, and saving the people from that exploding planet was the B plot. That should have been switched, I would think.
Yeah, I agree.
Now, JP, what do you think about the biggest criticism for Discovery? And
well, we've talked about a lot of it. It doesn't seem to have a vision, and some of that has to do with the fact that, like I've said it before, it feels like Discovery, because of 50 years of canon baggage and all this stuff and different contracts with different companies and things like that. It feels like Discovery is being created by lawyers as opposed to writers and producers and things like that. It almost feels like every line that they write, they have to check with somebody over on the legal team to make sure it's kosher, right? So they have a lot of obstacles. The writing team and the producers have obstacles, and that obstacle has to do with the corporate side of things. So I think if they find their vision, if they finally get a showrunner that's like fully legit showrunner for an entire season and not, switched over, or there's not behind the scenes drama, and the fact that they are now far enough in the timeline where they can create their own canon, and they seem to have learned, a little bit from the criticisms people are giving them. I think they could be set up to have a pretty successful third season, as long as the lawyers don't mess it up.
What do you think about that, Nick? What would you say is the biggest criticism for both shows? And, do you agree with it?
So I would say the biggest challenge of Star Trek Discovery is, I think JP hit it on the head there, which is it has a vision issue. It doesn't have a clear direction as to what the show wants itself to be. And I think that having a strong, dedicated showrunner to guide the ship, guide the crew and the cast into something, we can debate about that whatever that is later on in terms of quality, but keeping a coherent concept together and pushing it forward. I think they did a good job. They did a decent job with it in season 2. I think that there was definitely elements from different showrunners all over the place. But I think that it's one of the biggest challenges. It needs to find its footing and really start driving forward and doing its own thing. I think one of the biggest criticisms from the fan base about the show really has been the canon issue, in my opinion. And I'm basing that just off of the amount of comments that I get on it from the videos that I put up about Discovery. And I think that because they set the show into the future, I think they're going to quell a lot of those concerns. I think the biggest challenge facing the Orville right now is I feel like they need to start doing more unique stories. I feel like they need to start taking a few more risks. One of the issues that I have with the Orville is that there are times when I'm watching it that I feel like I've already seen that episode before because it's kind of a rehash of older sci-fi stories. I think that they've laid their groundwork. I feel like they've gotten their audience together. They've rallied them. People know what to expect. People are invested in the show. I feel like it's okay for them to start crafting some more unique stories that are a bit more out of the box and maybe a bit more unexpected. One of the biggest criticisms that I always see, again, in comments that I see in regards to the Orville is people like to call it the Snorville. Like that's a thing people like to call it because I think they find it rather boring. I think that has some connection to the thing I just mentioned, which is that the stories themselves are kind of redos of things we've seen before. But I think people seem to think like the show itself is boring because there's not a lot of action happening perhaps on screen, even though there are action oriented episodes, but they're mostly character stuff like we talked about earlier. So I feel like there may be some kind of disconnect with what people's expectations are of what a show like that is. So I think that is a big criticism. I don't agree with it fully. I tie it back to the plots and the storylines, but as far as because there isn't enough action or there isn't enough, drama or adventure stuff happening there, that it's not engaging enough. I disagree with that part of it. I think that the show is able to do really great character stories. And I do find myself invested as to what's going on with the characters, even if the story overall is kind of like bland or perhaps a rehash. The characters themselves and how they're going about the individual things oftentimes are unique into themselves. So
I will say, I think one of my biggest criticisms of the Orville is that they can kind of get wrapped up in the more mundane like character stuff. Like for instance, the episode where Gordon has the holodeck girlfriend based off of 20th Century Earth. Like even though it was a good episode and, we got to learn a lot about Gordon because, Gordon's whole thing is like, he's this kind of goofy guy who wants to, have a girlfriend and stuff, but he's kind of hopeless when it comes to women. And so like that episode kind of gave us like a lot of insight into, what it's like to be Gordon. But at the same time, it was just kind of like there was no bigger science fiction subplot going on to kind of really like hook me in into the narrative. And to contrast that, the Alara episode where she has to go in for gravity treatment on her home planet, I thought I was going to be really bored during that episode. And for like the first like half of it, I guess I kind of was, because it was just about, her and her family. And, she was never really a big, favorite of mine. And I was just kind of like, I'm going to suffer through this episode. But then like the last half of the episode, they introduced like some plot elements that made it like really enjoyable. And I feel like the Orville's still struggling to find that balance because it seemed like for the season 2, and JP, correct me if I'm wrong on this, they kind of blew most of their budget on Identity Parts 1 and 2. And so they had to really think of like kind of like very pedestrian episodes where they didn't have to spend a lot of money and still like, tell a good story because they had to allocate so much money to the effects for, Identity.
Yeah, I'm not even sure on that one. I mean, I could totally see what you're saying, but the show is done a little bit differently, whereas all the scripts are completely written before they ever start doing anything. So, I mean, they probably didn't know how much it was going to cost as far as effects go. They probably thought it might be expensive. I do know that the finale was way over budget, incredibly over budget. I mean, think about all the locations and all the effects and different setups and a whole new ship. Just like with Discovery, they had to build the Enterprise. That wasn't a redress. They built a new ship So we got to get a Captain Pike show because they have those sets now. And
Yes.
yeah, but it's yeah, I don't know because it's they write everything ahead of time. So I don't know if the budget had something to do with it. I just think it's a show with a different vision. It's not like I could say people complain with Discovery that they don't discover anything, they don't explore anything. We see some cool space science stuff on the Orville, but they're not really traveling around exploring strange new worlds and new civilizations either. They might come across, at the beginning of an episode, they're observing a binary system or something like that, and then a storyline, comes into play. So. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if they blew their budget on, if they planned on blowing their budget on Identity 2, and Identity Part 2, and it affected the rest of the season, or if that's just how they wrote it.
Well, the interesting thing about the Orville's future is that Disney now owns the Orville because they bought out Fox. So the question is, will Disney renew Orville and kind of make it a rival franchise to Star Trek, or will they can it and kind of go in their own direction? So what I want to end this this review with is your guys' predictions for season 3 of both shows. Nick, what do you think is going to happen in season 3 of the Orville? Will we get a season 3? And what do you think will happen in season 3 of Discovery?
I remain optimistic for the Orville. I think that they'll get a season 3 renewal. I think it'll happen. I think that the show overall, I don't know if it has the legs to spawn a franchise that lasts the test of time as like, say, Star Trek or even Star Wars or whatever it is. I don't know if it's got that oomph to it yet, but I think that given a few more seasons, I think it's possible that we could definitely get something to that level, going on into the future. I think they'll get their season 3, and I think that they'll continue to make more interesting sci-fi shows because it is a contrasting show to not just Star Trek Discovery, but to a lot of the other science fiction shows on television right now, which are all kind of focused in on this hyper-realistic, brutal kind of concept, which is everything is rough and tumbling around the edges, so it's a contrast to that. So there is a market, and that's really kind of untapped. So I think there's a selling point possibly behind scenes that they're probably using that as a good thing to say. As far as Discovery in the future, obviously we're going to get season 3. I think that because it's such a blank slate, I am eagerly awaiting to hear whatever they're going to do with it. And I think that they have the perfect opportunity to really knock it out of the park and do something unique and fun. But I think if they really miss the mark on season 3 and it still is super divisive to fans, I think that'll probably be the closeout for Discovery. I think, especially considering that there's every other week I keep reading about different shows coming out for Star Trek. So I feel like their focus may shift to something that doesn't cost them $8 million an episode. That's not doing so hot with fans. So they have season 3 is going to be a very critical season for them to move forward.
Where do you see the future of each show going, JP?
Well, with Discovery, I think, like Nick says, they have this huge opportunity with season 3. Are they going to step up to the challenge? We'll just have to wait and see. But it's different. The Orville and Discovery, I don't consider them competitors, right? A lot of my fan base, it's always like Orville versus Star Trek. I'm like, no, they're not competitors. They're not even on the same platform. They're just 2 science fiction shows, one that's labeled Star Trek and one that looks and feels like Star Trek. They're not competing. One's streaming, one's on primetime television. So I never get into that debate, really. Now, Discovery, as far as getting renewed, it has nothing to do really with the audience, loving it, or if it's bringing in enough people at this point. It's whether or not CBS wants to still invest money in it to try to get it to the point where it's bringing people in and, living up to people's expectations and advancing the franchise, bringing in the money, because really, if you think, all of this is about money. Both shows, every show we've ever seen, every movie we've ever seen, it's about bringing in investors, bringing in money. Today's entertainment the industry is very different. You could have the biggest name that you want, the biggest star it doesn't mean you're going to get the investors. It doesn't mean you can get your project made. It's very different times. So as far as becoming a franchise that has, spin-offs and things like that with the Orville, it's called the Orville. So Star Trek, you can have Star Trek Voyager, Star Trek The Next Generation, Star Trek this, that. I don't know how you're going to do the Orville something, something, something and have it be a spinoff. So that's something they're going to have to figure out. But also, I don't know if we're in a day and age where you can have a 13-episode show have spinoffs anymore. TV is so different. It's so expensive. There's so many, investors you have to get on board. So as far as the future of the Orville, I think it's definitely going to get renewed. We do have Disney in play. And there is a rumor going on. Rumor alert. It's just a rumor.
Rumor alert.
It's official until it's official, I always say. That Seth MacFarlane, his contract is up in June. And his big caveat is going forward with season 3 of the Orville, he wants to make sure that Disney has nothing to do, no input on how they make the show, right? If they can guarantee that, then he's fine to stay. If not, he's going to bail and take his stuff elsewhere, which then leads to the whole, well, does Netflix get it? Does Sony get it? Does Amazon get it? What are they going to do? Are they 10 episodes, 9 episodes, all this stuff? I think they're definitely going to get renewed, and I think Disney is smart enough to renew it because they realize there's a lot of merchandising opportunities with the Orville, and nobody knows merchandising better than Disney.
That's true. That's very true.
Yeah, I would really like to see the Orville get renewed, and I'd like to see Disney continue with it on Fox. And the thing about Discovery is that CBS is really, like, a lot of people, you can't judge Discovery based off of how you judge a show like the Orville in terms of ratings and things like that, because it is on a different platform. And so CBS looks at the subscriber numbers for Discovery. And I think it's been pretty consistent that when Discovery's airing, they see a spike in subscribers, and then as soon as the show's over, they see a drop in subscribers. And the reason that they're pushing out so many of these Star Trek spinoffs is because they want to make it so that they can retain all these Star Trek fans for that sweet, revenue money, subscription money. So like after season 3 of Discovery, it goes right into the Picard show, and then it goes right into the Section 31 show or whatever. And so like basically for 12 months out of the year, you have new Star Trek being fed into the CBS All Access machine to keep the Star Trek faithful subscribed and getting their money. And I think that's kind of what CBS is aiming for. Whereas with Orville, it's just like, well, just renew it. Just give us 21 episodes over the course of a year, and everyone is happy and making money.
Please give us 21 episodes. Anything nowadays.
All right. So we talked about a lot of stuff today, and we talked about it. Why don't we wrap this up? JP, why don't you tell everyone where they can find out more about you?
You can look at the back of a carton of milk, because I go missing quite often. You can find me on egotasticfuntime.com. Yeah, that's actually a thing. egotasticfuntime.com. You can find me Egotastic Funtime on YouTube. That's where all my content mostly comes from. I know it's hard to spell Egotastic Funtime, so you can just type in Talking the Orville. You will find me. And we'll have an Egotastic Funtime. You can also find me at EgotasticFT on Twitter, and we'll have some awesome, fun conversations about Star Trek, sci-fi, the Orville, all that great stuff. And it'll be a fun time, you guys. Come join me.
Yes. JP has a great YouTube channel. I watch it quite often. And especially if you're a fan of the Orville, he does extensive, coverage on that. So it's really worth checking out and subscribing to, and hitting that bell icon so his new videos are coming out. Nick, why don't you tell people where they can find out more about you?
Yeah, you can find me on YouTube. Just search for Ketwolski. When you do that, it's going to come up saying, "Did you mean Kowalski?" And you can just say no. You can find me on there and on Twitter at Real Ketwolski, where I do a lot of conversations there. That's kind of the easiest way to reach out to me and ask me any questions you guys may have. I kind of keep my focus mainly on Star Trek, although sometimes I do talk a little bit about the Orville here and there. But yeah, you guys can reach out to me there, and we talk about everything on that channel, from Star Trek lore to productions to behind-the-scenes stuff to latest news, just kind of Star Trek in general. So come on by and join in the chat.
All right, JP, Ketwolski, thank you guys so much for coming on today and talking about these two great TV shows. Hopefully we'll get more of them in the future, and lots of stuff to complain about and praise. And for all you out there watching, my name is Matthew Kadish. Thank you for spending a couple hours with us, and I will catch you in the next episode. Peace.